The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell against the cobblestones of Düsseldorf in thin, relentless sheets, pooling in the grooves between old tram lines, darkening the facades of buildings already grey with the weight of a wounded republic. The street lamps along the Flingen district burned a weak amber through the mist, and the few souls still walking after nightfall walked quickly, with their collars raised and their eyes cast low. It was the autumn of 1929, and the city had begun to understand that something moved among them, something that chose its victims without pattern and without mercy, something that carried scissors and hammers and a thirst that no court physician could name. The police headquarters on Müllerstrasse had received more than 13,000 letters from the public, yet 900,000 names had been compiled upon a suspect list that grew longer with each passing week, and still the bodies appeared, women and children and men, stabbed and bludgeoned and left in the frost of parks and alleyways, their blood soaking into the Rhine-soaked earth of a city that could no longer sleep. The newspapers had given the killer a name. They called him the Vampire of Düsseldorf, and he was not yet finished. Chapter 1. The House on the Narrow Street. Good evening, and welcome. You have found your way here again, or perhaps for the first time, and either way the night is better for it. This is the Bedside Historian, and wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour the clock has struck in your corner of the world, you're welcome to stay as long as you wish. If you're lying in the dark, let the dark be kind to you. If the rain is falling where you are, let it fall. There is nothing asked of you here but stillness. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now would be a gentle moment to do so, for it is your presence, your listening, your quiet company across the miles that allows these stories to continue being told. A like, a subscription, a small gesture in the dark, it matters more than you might think, and it is deeply appreciated. Now then, let the world outside grow distant. Let the hum of the present fade. We are going backward tonight, far backward, into the grey and rain-streaked heart of industrial Germany, into a century that has not yet learned the horrors it will produce, into a house so small and so wretched that the walls themselves seem to sweat with misery. Yeah, let us begin where all such stories must begin, not with the crime, but with the child. The house stood in Mülheim am Rhein, a workers' district on the eastern bank of the river, pressed between the smoke of factories and the low grey sky of the Rhineland. It was not truly a house in any generous sense of the word. It was a single room, damp-walled and airless, situated within a tenement building where the corridors smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap, and the particular staleness of too many people living too close together with too little hope. In this room, in the spring of 1883, a boy named Peter Kürten was born, the first surviving child of a family that would eventually number 13. The date was the 26th of May. The German Empire was 12 years old. Bismarck still governed from Berlin. The great factories of the Ruhr belched their smoke into a sky that had not been truly blue in living memory. And in the small, suffocating world of that one-room apartment, the boy opened his eyes for the first time into a darkness that would never fully leave him. His father was a moulder by trade, a man who shaped metal in the heat of the foundry, and who carried the violence of that work home with him each evening like soot on his skin. He was an alcoholic of the most savage kind, not the sort who drank and grew quiet, but the sort who drank and grew cruel, whose hands found their purpose not in tenderness, but in punishment. The elder Kürten beat his wife. He beat his children. He beat them when they spoke and when they did not speak, when they ate too slowly and when they breathed too loudly. And the blows came not with any pretense of discipline, but with the blind, grinding fury of a man who despised the life he had made and could find no outlet for that hatred except the bodies nearest to him. The mother endured it as women of that time and that class so often endured it, in silence, in resignation, in the slow erosion of whatever spirit she had once possessed. There was no refuge, there was no separation, there was only the room, the children, the bottle, and the fists. But the violence was not the worst of it. What the elder Kürten inflicted upon his family behind that closed door went beyond the ordinary miseries of poverty and drunkenness. He was a man of perverse and grotesque appetites, and he exercised them without shame or concealment. On many evenings, after the drink had taken full hold of him, he would order his wife and children to assemble before him in that single room. He would then command his wife to undress, and he would force himself upon her in full view of the children, some of whom were barely old enough to walk. The children watched because they had no choice. The room had no partitions, no curtains, no second door through which to escape. They sat or stood or lay on the floor and witnessed what no child should ever witness, the degradation of their mother carried out by a father who regarded his own family as something less than human. This was not an isolated occurrence. It was a ritual, repeated with the regularity of the factory whistle, night after night, week after week, year after year. The boy Peter, as the eldest, bore the brunt of this exposure. He saw everything. He heard everything. And something inside him, something that in another life might have grown toward the warmth or trust or ordinary human feeling, began instead to twist inward, to harden, to calcify into a shape that no amount of later years could undo. By the time Peter Kürten was 9 years old, he had already begun to exhibit behaviours that, in a later century, might have drawn the attention of physicians or welfare authorities. But in the Mülheim of the 1890s there were no such authorities. There were only the streets, the factories, the churches and the prisons, and for a boy born into the lowest tier of the German working class, the streets were the most immediate schoolroom. Peter had begun running away from home with increasing frequency, sleeping in doorways and under bridges, thus stealing bread from market stalls and coins from the pockets of drunks who had passed out along the riverbank. He was small for his age, quick-fingered, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a quietness that adults often mistook for obedience. He learned early that silence was a kind of armour, that the boy who said nothing was the boy who was overlooked, and that being overlooked was the closest thing to safety that his world could offer. It was during these years of wandering that the boy encountered a figure who would leave an indelible mark upon the shape of his cruelty. In the same tenement building where the Kürten family lived, there resided a man who worked as a dog catcher for the local municipality. This man, whose name has not survived in the historical record with any certainty, took an interest in the boy. He allowed Peter to accompany him on his rounds through the streets and alleys of Mülheim, collecting strays and unwanted animals. But the dog catcher's interest in animals was not one of care. He was a man who derived pleasure from the suffering of the creatures he collected, and in the privacy of his quarters he taught the boy how to torture them. He showed him how to hold a dog still while it writhed, how to cut slowly, how to watch the light go out of an animal's eyes with the patience of a craftsman studying his work. Peter Kürten, aged 9 or 10, absorbed these lessons with a quietness that the dog catcher may have mistaken for reluctance. It was not reluctance, it was attention. The boy's cruelty toward animals grew rapidly in the months that followed. He began to seek out opportunities on his own, of visiting farms on the outskirts of Mülheim, where sheep and goats grazed unattended in muddy fields. He tortured these animals with a methodical calm that belied his age, and he discovered, in the act of inflicting pain, a sensation that he had never experienced before, a warmth, a tightness, a rising wave of something that he did not yet have the language to name, but that he would later, in the cold light of a prison interview room, describe to a distinguished psychiatrist as the first stirrings of a compulsion that would govern the rest of his life. The sight of blood in particular produced in the boy a reaction that was not horror, not fascination, but something closer to hunger. He did not recoil from it. He leaned toward it. He wanted more of it. And in the absence of any adult who might have recognised what was happening, Stersti. In the absence of any structure of care or intervention or even basic human attention, the hunger grew. There was another incident during these early years, one that Peter Kürten himself would later recount to the psychiatrist Karl Berg, with a calmness that Berg found deeply unsettling. Kürten claimed that at the age of 9 he had drowned 2 of his schoolmates while swimming in the Rhine. The story, as he told it, was simple. The 3 boys had been playing on a makeshift raft near the riverbank. Peter had pushed one of them into the water. When the second boy dived in to rescue his friend, Peter held both of them beneath the surface until they stopped moving. The river carried their bodies downstream, and the incident was recorded at the time as a tragic accident. 2 boys lost to the current, a commonplace sorrow in a district where children played unsupervised along dangerous waterways. No suspicion fell upon Peter Kürten. He was 9 years old, he was quiet, he was small, and the world moved on. Whether this account is entirely truthful has been debated by scholars of criminal history in the decades since. Kürten was, by the time he confessed it, a man who had learned that confession itself could be a form of performance, that the recounting of atrocity could produce in his listeners a reaction that he found pleasurable. But the psychiatrist Berg, who spent more hours with Kürten than any other professional, believed the account to be credible. It fit the pattern. It fit the trajectory. A boy raised in violence, trained in cruelty by a neighbouring dog catcher, exposed nightly to scenes of degradation that no child's mind could process without damage. Such a boy, Berg concluded, was entirely capable of murder before his 10th birthday. The seeds had been planted not by any single event, but by the unrelenting accumulation of horror that constituted Peter Kürten's childhood. A childhood in which love was absent, safety was unknown, and the only reliable truth was that the strong did what they wished to the weak, and the weak endured it, or they did not. The elder Kürten's reign over his family came to a partial end in 1897, when he was arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison for the repeated violation of his eldest daughter, Peter's sister, who was 13 years old at the time. The arrest did not come as a result of any courageous disclosure by the family. It came, as such things often came in that era, through the intervention of neighbours whose patience had been exhausted, not by moral outrage, but by the noise, the disturbance, the sheer unpleasantness of living adjacent to a household in which screaming was as regular as the church bells. The father was taken away. The mother, freed at last from the immediate threat of his presence, obtained a legal separation and eventually remarried, relocating the remnants of her family to Düsseldorf. But the damage, as the physicians of a later generation would have understood, was already done. The boy Peter was 14 years old. He had spent the entirety of his conscious life inside a single room with a monster, and the monster had not merely brutalised him. The monster had shaped him. The monster had taught him, by example and by repetition, that human beings were objects upon which one exercised power, that suffering was a spectacle to be witnessed and savoured, and that the world offered no consequence to the strong that could not be endured. Peter Kürten left that household carrying nothing of material value. He had no education to speak of, no trade, no prospects, no connections to any institution that might have guided him toward a different path. What he carried instead was invisible and far more durable. He carried a rage that had no name and no target, a compulsion toward violence that had already found its earliest expressions in the drowning of children and the torture of animals, and a relationship with blood that was not one of fear, but of need. He carried the memory of his father's hands and his father's appetites, and his father's absolute indifference to the suffering of others, and he carried, beneath the quiet exterior that so many would later remark upon, a coldness so profound that the psychiatrist who would eventually study him would search in vain for any trace of ordinary human feeling, any flicker of remorse, any evidence that the boy who had watched his mother's humiliation night after night had retained even the faintest capacity for empathy. The family's move to Düsseldorf changed the geography of Peter Kürten's life, but not its direction. The city was larger than Mülheim, busier, more anonymous, a place where a young man with quick hands and a quiet manner could disappear into the crowd and emerge only when he chose to. Kürten was soon living on the streets again, stealing, drifting, sleeping in doorways and charitable shelters, accumulating the first of what would become an almost incomprehensible number of criminal convictions. By the time he was 16, he had been arrested for theft and sentenced to his first term in prison. It was a short sentence, a matter of weeks, but it introduced him to an institution that would become, in a terrible irony, the closest thing to a home he would ever know. The German prison system of the late 19th century was not a system designed to reform. It was a system designed to punish, and it punished with a thoroughness that left its marks not on the skin but on the soul. Kürten entered prison as a petty thief with violent inclinations. He would leave it, again and again, as something considerably worse. The night deepened over the Rhineland. The factories fell silent. The river moved on in its ancient indifferent way, carrying with it the debris of a city that did not yet know what it had produced. And in a cell, somewhere in the Prussian penal system, a young man with pale eyes and a soft voice lay on a narrow cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about blood. He thought about the way it looked in lamplight, the way it smelled when it was warm, the way it moved across skin like a living thing with a will of its own. He thought about the dog catcher's hands. He thought about the Rhine. He thought about his father, and he waited with a patience that was not patience at all, but something far more dangerous, for for the world to release him again. Chapter 2. The Dog Catcher's Apprentice. The tenement buildings of Mülheim am Rhein stood in crooked rows along streets that had never been intended for beauty, streets laid down in haste during the first great surge of industrial expansion, when the foundries and the chemical works and the textile mills had drawn families from the countryside like moths toward a furnace that promised warmth, but delivered only heat. The buildings were of dark brick, stained darker still by decades of coal smoke, and their windows were small and set deep into the walls as though the architects had wished to admit as little of the outside world as possible. In the courtyards between these buildings, where the light fell only at midday and only in summer, children played among the puddles and the refuse, and dogs wandered in loose, wary packs. He is nosing at the gutters for scraps of fat or bone. It was in one of these courtyards, sometime around the year 1892, that Peter Kürten first encountered the man who would become his second and perhaps more consequential teacher in the art of cruelty. The dog catcher was employed by the municipality of Mülheim to collect stray and unwanted animals from the streets, a task that in that era carried none of the institutional oversight or procedural regulation that a later century would impose. He was given a cart, a net, a length of rope, and the authority to remove any animal that the local constabulary deemed a nuisance. What he did with those animals once they were in his possession was his own affair, and the affair, as Peter Kürten would later describe to the psychiatrist Karl Berg, was one of systematic and inventive brutality. The dog catcher did not merely collect animals, he tortured them. He did so in the privacy of his quarters, which occupied a room in the same tenement building where the Kürten family lived, and he did so with an enthusiasm that suggests he had found, in his municipal appointment, a vocation perfectly suited to the darkest corners of his nature. How the relationship between the man and the boy began is not recorded with precision. What is known is that by the time Peter was 9 or 10 years old, he had become a regular companion on the dog catcher's rounds, trailing behind the cart through the streets and alleys of Mülheim, helping to corner strays in dead-end passageways, learning to read the body language of frightened animals with the attentiveness of a student who has found, at last, a subject that holds his complete attention. The dog catcher, for his part, seemed to welcome the boy's company. Perhaps he recognised in Peter a kindred disposition. Perhaps he simply enjoyed having an audience. Whatever the reason, he allowed the boy to witness, and eventually to participate in, acts of cruelty toward the captured animals that went far beyond anything the municipality had sanctioned or imagined. In the dog catcher's room, behind a door that was always locked, Peter Kürten received an education that no school in Mülheim could have provided. He learned how to restrain an animal so that it could not bite or scratch. He learned where the veins ran close to the surface, where a cut would produce the most blood with the least immediate fatality. How to prolong the suffering of a creature that was already beyond any hope of rescue. He learned, too, something about himself that he had perhaps already suspected but had not yet confirmed, that the sight of an animal in pain produced in him not the revulsion that it produced in other children, not the pity, not the urge to look away, but a sensation of warmth and tightness and mounting excitement that concentrated itself in his body with an intensity he had never known. The blood, in particular, held him. He watched it with the rapt attention of a boy watching a magic trick, as though the redness of it, the warmth of it, the way it pooled and spread and caught the light, contained some secret that he was on the verge of understanding. It would be tempting, from the vantage of a later age, to see in this relationship the clear outline of a corrupted innocence, to say that the dog catcher made Peter Kürten what he became, that without this man's influence the boy might have grown into something other than a monster. But the historical record does not support so simple a narrative. The dog catcher's cruelty found in Peter Kürten not a blank surface upon which to write, but a surface already scored with deep and jagged lines. The boy had already witnessed years of his father's violence. He had already been subjected to scenes of degradation that had warped his understanding of what human beings were and what they could do to one another. He had already, if his own later testimony is to be believed, held 2 children beneath the waters of the Rhine and watched them drown. The dog catcher did not create Peter Kürten's appetite for suffering. He refined it. He gave it method. He gave it focus. And he gave it, perhaps most dangerously of all, a context in which it could be practiced without consequence. For no one in Mülheim am Rhein in the year 1892 cared very much what happened to stray dogs behind a locked door in a tenement building on the wrong side of the river. As Peter grew older, His cruelty toward animals expanded beyond the confines of the dog-catcher's room. He began to venture alone to the farms and pastures on the outskirts of Mülheim, where livestock grazed in fields bordered by hedgerows and drainage ditches. Sheep were his most frequent targets, slow-moving and docile creatures that could be approached without difficulty and restrained without great strength. He stabbed them with knives stolen from his mother's kitchen, or with sharpened sticks fashioned from branches. He watched them bleed. He watched them shudder and fall and grow still. And with each act, the sensation he had first discovered in the dog-catcher's room grew stronger, more defined, more necessary. It was not merely excitement. It was not merely pleasure. It was, as he would later explain to Berg, with the clinical detachment of a man describing a medical condition, a form of completion, as though the act of inflicting suffering upon a living creature filled a void inside him that nothing else could reach. The streets of Mülheim offered their own education during these years. Peter Kürten was not the only boy in the district who survived by theft and cunning. There were gangs of children, loosely organised and fiercely territorial, who roamed the industrial quarters in search of anything that could be eaten, sold or traded. Peter moved among them but was never truly of them. He was too quiet, too watchful, too self-contained. The other boys fought openly, with fists and shouts and the clumsy bravado of children imitating the adults they feared. Peter fought differently. He fought with patience, with calculation, with a willingness to wait for the moment when his opponent was distracted or off balance before striking with a sudden and disproportionate force that left the other boys wary of him. He did not boast about his victories. He did not seek alliances or friendships. He moved through the social world of the Mülheim streets like a shadow passing over water, present but never quite touching, never quite belonging. His schooling, such as it was, had effectively ended by the time he was 12. The public schools of the district were overcrowded and underfunded, staffed by teachers who had neither the resources nor the inclination to pursue truant pupils through the warrens of the industrial quarter. Peter Kürten's absences went unrecorded and unlamented. He could read, after a fashion. He could write his name. He could add and subtract well enough to know when a shopkeeper was cheating him. Beyond that, the formal institutions of German education had nothing to offer him, and he had nothing to offer them. His real education, the one that would matter, was taking place in the courtyards and the fields and the locked rooms of Mülheim, in the places where blood was shed and no one came to ask why. The relationship with the dog catcher appears to have continued for several years, though the precise duration is uncertain. What is known is that by the time Peter Kürten entered his teenage years, the appetite that the dog catcher had helped to sharpen had grown beyond anything that the torture of animals could satisfy. The boy who had once watched dogs die in a locked room now walked the streets of Mülheim and Düsseldorf with a different kind of attention, studying the people around him not as a pickpocket studies a crowd, looking for the fattest wallet or the loosest clasp, but as a predator studies a landscape, noting the places where the light failed, where the alleys narrowed, where a person walking alone at night might be approached without being seen by anyone else. He was not yet ready to act upon these observations. He was still young, still small, still dependent upon the anonymity that his age afforded him. But the observations were being made, catalogued, stored away with the same quiet meticulousness that characterized everything he did. The river moved on. The factories poured their smoke into the Rhineland sky. The dog-catcher continued his rounds through the streets of Mülheim, his cart rattling over the cobblestones, his net draped over one shoulder like a fisherman heading for the shore. And the boy who walked beside him, the boy with the pale eyes and the soft voice and the hands that had already learned to hold a creature still while its life drained away, that boy was growing. He was growing taller and stronger and more patient, and the thing inside him that had first stirred in the dog-catcher's room was growing too, feeding on every act of cruelty he witnessed or committed, expanding to fill the empty spaces that his childhood had carved into his soul. He did not yet know what he would become. The word for it had not yet been spoken, but the shape of it was already there, already formed, already waiting beneath the surface of that quiet, watchful face, like a blade beneath still water. The years between 12 and 16 were years of drift and petty crime, of short stays in charitable institutions and shorter stays in the homes of relatives who had neither the patience nor the means to keep him. Kürten stole, he trespassed. He set small fires in barns and sheds on the outskirts of the city, not for warmth or for profit, but for the pleasure of watching the flames take hold, of hearing the shouts of the people who came running, chasse, of standing among the crowd of onlookers with an expression of innocent concern while inside him the same warmth rose and crested and broke like a wave upon a darkened shore. Arson, he would later tell Berg, had been one of his earliest and most reliable sources of the sensation he craved, second only to the sight of blood. There was something about fire, about its indiscriminate hunger, its absolute refusal to distinguish between the valuable and the worthless, that spoke to something deep within him. Fire did not judge. Fire did not hesitate. Fire consumed, and in consuming, it transformed the ordinary world into something vivid and urgent and alive with destruction. By the time he was 16, in the year 1899, Peter Kürten had accumulated enough minor convictions to draw the sustained attention of the local constabulary. He was arrested for theft and sentenced to his first term of imprisonment, a brief sentence served in a facility designed for juvenile offenders. The experience did not frighten him, it did not reform him. What it did, with a thoroughness that the magistrates who sentenced him could not have foreseen, was introduce him to a population of older, more experienced criminals whose company would accelerate his education in ways that the dog catcher of Mülheim could never have managed. In prison, Kürten listened. He observed. He learned. And when he emerged, weeks later, blinking into the grey light of a Rhineland morning, he was no longer the petty thief who had entered. He was something harder, something colder, something that had begun to understand, with a clarity that would only sharpen in the years ahead, that the world was divided into those who acted and those who suffered, and that he had no intention of remaining among the latter. The century turned. The old world groaned beneath the weight of its own contradictions, empires and poverty, progress and squalor, the gleaming machinery of modernity built upon the broken backs of men and women who would never ride in the carriages or dine at the tables that their labour made possible. And in a narrow street in the industrial Rhineland, a young man with a record of petty crime and a secret history of violence that no court document had yet recorded, walked out into the new century with his hands in his pockets and his collar turned against the wind. The 20th century had begun, as it did not yet know what walked among its citizens, but it would learn. Chapter 3. The Revolving Door of Iron. The prisons of the German Empire in the final years of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th were not places designed for the correction of wayward souls. They were places designed for the administration of punishment, and they administered it with the same mechanical efficiency that characterized the factories and the foundries and the railway systems of the Kaiserreich. The cells were small, the walls were thick, the food was poor, the light was thin, and the silence, in those institutions that practiced solitary confinement as a matter of routine, was of a quality so absolute that it could drive a man inward upon himself until the boundary between thought and madness became a line drawn in smoke. It was into this system that Peter Kürten was fed, again and again, throughout the first 2 decades of his adult life, passing through its iron doors with a regularity that became, in time, the closest thing to a rhythm that his existence possessed. His first adult sentence came in 1900 for a combination of theft and fraud, and it was served in a facility where the conditions were harsh enough to have broken a man of ordinary constitution. Kürten was not a man of ordinary constitution. He entered the prison with a rage that had been building since childhood, a rage that had no single object but that attached itself, with the indiscriminate adhesion of flame to dry wood, to every figure of authority he encountered, every guard who spoke to him with contempt, every warden who enforced the regulations with the impersonal cruelty of a man turning a crank. The prison did not diminish this rage. The prison fed it. Each sentence, each period of confinement, each stretch of days and weeks and months spent in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, added another layer to the structure of hatred that Kürten was building inside himself. A structure that grew not outward, in the form of defiance or rebellion, but inward, in the form of fantasy. It was in prison that Peter Kürten discovered the power of his own imagination as a tool of survival, and more significantly as a source of the sensation he had first encountered in the dog-catcher's room in Mülheim. In solitary confinement, deprived of all external stimulation, of all human contact, of all sensory input save the sound of his own breathing and the faint drip of water somewhere in the stone corridor beyond his door, Kürten turned inward and found there a landscape of extraordinary vividness. He fantasized about acts of violence. He fantasized about blood. He constructed elaborate scenarios in his mind, scenarios involving the torture and murder of people he had known or seen or simply imagined. And he discovered that these fantasies produced in him the same physical response that the torture of animals had produced in his boyhood. The same warmth, the same tightness, the same rising wave of excitement that culminated in a release so intense that it left him trembling on his cot in the darkness of his cell. The fantasies became, in time, as more important to him than any reality the prison could offer. They were his private kingdom, his sealed chamber, the one domain over which the wardens and the guards and the judges had no authority. They could lock his body in a cell. They could not lock his mind. The pattern of Kürten's early criminal career was one of brief periods of freedom punctuated by increasingly frequent returns to prison. He stole. He was caught. He was sentenced. He served his time. He was released. He stole again. The cycle repeated with a monotony that the court records of the period document in terse, bureaucratic language, each entry a variation on the same theme, the same name, the same offences, the same disposition. What the court records do not document because no court had yet thought to ask. Here was what was happening inside Peter Kürten's mind during these years, what was growing in the dark soil of his imagination, what shape the fantasies were taking as he lay on his cot in one cell after another, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, waiting. He was not an unintelligent man. This was one of the details that would later unsettle those who encountered him. The contrast between the monstrousness of his acts and the ordinariness, even the respectability of his outward presentation. Kürten could be charming when he chose to be. He could be polite, deferential, soft-spoken. He dressed neatly when he had the means to do so. He spoke in complete sentences. He read newspapers and followed the political affairs of the day with a genuine, if superficial, interest. In prison, he was generally regarded as a model inmate, quiet, compliant, causing no trouble for the guards, attracting no disciplinary attention. This was not because he had been reformed. It was because he had learned, with the same quick adaptability that had served him on the streets of Mülheim, that compliance was a form of camouflage, that the prisoner who caused no trouble was the prisoner who was left alone, and that being left alone was the condition most conducive to the cultivation of the inner life that had become his truest and most dangerous possession. During one of his longer sentences served in the early years of the new century, Kürten made a deliberate and calculated decision that revealed the depth of his self-awareness. He began to break prison rules intentionally, not out of defiance or frustration, but in order to be sentenced to solitary confinement. The rules he broke were minor, sufficient to warrant isolation but not severe enough to attract the kind of attention that might have led to a more thorough examination of his character. He wanted to be alone. He wanted the silence. He wanted the darkness. Because it was in solitary confinement that his fantasies reached their greatest intensity, that the visions of blood and suffering played out in his mind with a clarity and a vividness that the distractions of communal prison life diluted and diminished. Other prisoners feared solitary confinement. They begged to be returned to the general population, to the noise and the crowding and the petty brutalities of shared existence. Peter Kürten sorted out the way a man dying of thirst seeks out water. It was his sustenance, it was his rehearsal, and each time he emerged from it, he was more certain of what he would do when the prison doors finally opened for good. In 1904, Kürten was called up for military service, conscripted into the army of the Kaiser, as Germany's imperial ambitions continued to expand across the map of Europe and beyond. Military discipline, with its emphasis on obedience, hierarchy, and the subordination of individual will to collective purpose, was perhaps the worst possible environment for a man of Kürten's temperament. He had spent his entire life refusing to submit to any authority that he did not choose, and the army offered him no choice at all. He deserted almost immediately, abandoning his barracks and disappearing into the civilian landscape with the practiced ease of a man who had been evading authority since childhood. He was eventually captured, tried for desertion, and sentenced to a further period of imprisonment, this time in a military facility where the conditions were, if anything, harsher than those he had experienced in civilian prisons. The cycle continued. The iron door opened, the iron door closed, and inside the cell the fantasies grew more elaborate, more violent, more specific. It was during these years of imprisonment that Kürten began to develop a fascination with arson, that would persist for the rest of his life. He had set fires before as a boy in Mülheim, but those had been small, impulsive acts, experiments in destruction carried out with the carelessness of youth. In prison, thinking about fire became a disciplined exercise, a way of planning future crimes that combined the thrill of destruction with the pleasure of public spectacle. Kürten loved the idea of fire not merely for the damage it caused but for the terror it inspired. The way a single flame could send an entire neighbourhood into panic. The way the sight of a burning building drew crowds of people whose faces, lit by the flames, displayed the full spectrum of human distress, fear, shock, grief, helplessness. These were the expressions he craved. These were the reactions that fed the hunger inside him. And in the darkness of his cell, he planned fires the way an architect plans buildings, with care and precision and an eye for maximum effect. The years passed, sentences were served and completed. Kürten was released and rearrested, the rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock in an empty room. By the time the Great War broke out in 1914, he had accumulated a criminal record of extraordinary length, dozens of convictions for theft, fraud, arson, and assault, a catalogue of offences that painted the portrait of a career criminal, but that concealed, behind its bureaucratic ordinariness, the far more disturbing reality of what Peter Kürten had become in the privacy of his own mind. He was not merely a thief, he was not merely an arsonist. He was a man who had spent years, perhaps decades, rehearsing acts of violence so extreme that the petty crimes for which he was known were merely the visible surface of an iceberg whose true mass lay hidden beneath the waterline. The war itself touched Kürten's life only glancingly. His desertion from the army had ensured that he would spend the war years not in the trenches but in prison, and it was in prison that he remained while the battles raged at the Marne and the Somme and Verdun, while millions of young men died in the mud of Flanders, while the German Empire strained and cracked and began its slow, agonising collapse. Kürten heard about the war through the prison grapevine, through the scraps of newspaper that occasionally found their way into the cells, through the conversations of guards who spoke of casualties and rationing, and the growing desperation of the home front. He listened with interest but without emotion. The suffering of others, even on a scale as vast as the war had produced, did not move him to pity. It moved him to something else entirely, a recognition perhaps that the world outside the prison walls was engaged in the same business that occupied his private fantasies, the business of inflicting suffering upon human bodies, and that the only difference between a soldier and a murderer was the uniform and the permission of the state. By 1921, when Kürten was finally released from his longest continuous period of imprisonment, the world he emerged into was a different world from the one he had left. The Kaiser was gone. The Empire was gone. Germany was a republic now, fragile and humiliated, burdened by reparations and inflation, and the simmering resentments of a population that had been promised glory and delivered ruin. The streets of the Rhineland were full of unemployed men and desperate women and children who went to bed hungry. The old certainties had been swept away, and in their place there was only uncertainty, only the sense that the ground beneath one's feet was no longer solid, just that anything might happen, that the rules that had once governed the lives of ordinary people no longer applied. For a man like Peter Kürten, this atmosphere of collapse and instability was not a cause for despair. It was an opportunity. The world had broken open, the cracks were wide enough to walk through, and through them, with the quiet deliberation of a man who had been planning this moment for 20 years, Peter Kürten walked. Chapter 4. The Tavern in Mülheim. The spring of 1913 arrived in the Rhineland with a softness that seemed almost apologetic, as though the season itself were aware of the harshness that had preceded it. The winter had been long and bitter. The kind of winter that settled into the bones of the old and the poor and did not leave until the first true warmth of April had baked the dampness from the walls of the tenement buildings. The trees along the Rhine began to bud in late March, cautiously, as though uncertain whether the frost had truly finished its work. The river ran high with meltwater from the hills to the south, brown and swollen and fast, carrying with it the accumulated debris of a season's worth of ice and mud. And in the industrial towns that lined its banks, Mülheim and Cologne and Düsseldorf and Duisburg, life resumed its ordinary rhythms, the factory whistles at dawn, the clamour of the markets at midday, the quiet closing of shutters at dusk as the streets emptied and the lamplighters made their rounds. Peter Kürten was 29 years old. He had been recently released from prison, one of the many short sentences that had punctuated his adult life like commas, in a sentence that never seemed to reach its end. He was living in the Mülheim district, the same district in which he had been born, the same district in which the dog catcher had taught him the art of cruelty and the Rhine had swallowed his childhood companions. He had no steady employment. He had no fixed address. He survived, as he had always survived, by theft, by petty fraud, by the exercise of a cunning that had been sharpened by decades of practice. He moved through the streets of Mülheim with the familiarity of a man walking through the rooms of his own house, knowing every alley, every courtyard, every doorway that might serve as a hiding place or an escape route. He was, to all outward appearances, nothing more than another down-at-heel criminal in a district full of them, unremarkable, unthreatening, the sort of man whose face was forgotten the moment one looked away. But something had changed inside Peter Kürten during his most recent stretch of imprisonment, something that the court records and the police files and the reports of the prison wardens had not captured and could not have captured, because it existed in a realm beyond the reach of bureaucratic documentation. The fantasies that had sustained him through years of solitary confinement had reached a pitch of intensity that could no longer be satisfied by imagination alone. The rehearsals were over, the planning was done. The hunger that had first stirred in the dog catcher's room, that had grown through years of animal torture and arson, and the dark elaborations of his prison fantasies, had become a physical compulsion, a pressure behind his eyes, a tightness in his chest, a constant and unrelenting demand that could be answered only by an act of real and irreversible violence against a human being. Kürten knew this. He had known it for some time. And in the spring of 1913, moving through the streets of Mülheim in the soft light of a season that promised renewal, he began to look for his opportunity. His method of searching was not the frenzied stalking of a man driven by sudden impulse. It was methodical, patient, almost professional in its deliberateness. Kürten had spent years studying the rhythms of the industrial districts, the times at which the streets were busiest and the times at which they were most deserted, the habits of the police patrols, the locations of the taverns and the public houses where working families gathered in the evenings, leaving their homes unattended. He specialised during this period in the burglary of taverns, establishments where the owners lived in apartments above their premises, and where the transition between the public area downstairs and the private quarters upstairs was often secured by nothing more substantial than a latch or a bolt that could be forced with a penknife. He entered these premises at night, moving through the darkened rooms with a silence that suggested long practice, taking whatever cash or valuables he could find and departing without waking the occupants. It was a profitable enterprise, a low in risk and adequate in reward, and it might have continued indefinitely had it not brought Peter Kürten, on the night of the 25th of May, 1913, to a tavern in Mülheim am Rhein, where a 9-year-old girl named Christine Klein lay sleeping in an upstairs bedroom. The tavern was a modest establishment, of the kind that served the working men of the district cheap beer and simple food. Its owners, the Klein family, lived in the rooms above, and on the evening of the 25th the parents were working downstairs in the bar while their daughter slept in her bed on the floor above. The night was warm, the windows were open, the sounds of the tavern below, the murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter, drifted upward through the floorboards and mingled with the sounds of the street outside, the distant clatter of a horse-drawn cart, the barking of a dog, the slow tolling of a church bell marking the hour. Christine Klein slept through it all, a child in a bed in a room that should have been safe, in a building full of adults who should have been watchful, on a night that should have been no different from any other. Peter Kürten entered the building through a ground-floor window that had been left ajar. He moved through the lower rooms with the practised silence of a man who had broken into dozens of similar premises, avoiding the areas where the floorboards creaked, keeping close to the walls where the wood was better supported and less likely to betray his presence. He found the staircase and descended step by careful step, and pausing at each landing to listen for any sound that might indicate he had been detected. There was nothing. The tavern hummed on below, the street murmured on outside. The building held its breath. He found the girl's room. The door was unlocked, perhaps even open. The room was small, sparsely furnished, lit by the faint glow of a street lamp that filtered through the window and cast long, distorted shadows across the walls and the floor and the narrow bed where Christine Klein lay sleeping. She was 9 years old, she was small. She did not wake when Kürten entered the room. She did not wake when he approached her bed. She did not wake until his hands were around her throat, and by then, waking was no longer a pathway to safety but a doorway into the last and most terrible moments of her life. What happened in that room was an act of such savagery that the police officers who arrived the following morning, summoned by the girl's parents when they found her body, were unable to speak of it for several days without visible distress. Kürten had strangled the child. He had then produced a pocket knife and slashed her throat twice, deeply, the cuts severing the major blood vessels on both sides of her neck. The blood had poured from the wounds in quantities that soaked the bedding, the mattress, the floor beneath the bed, and the walls against which it had been thrown by the force of the child's dying convulsions. Kürten, by his own later account, had experienced a state of extreme arousal during the attack, triggered specifically by the sound of the blood dripping from the bed onto the floor, so he had remained in the room for some minutes after the child was dead, standing in the darkness, listening to that sound, letting it wash through him like music. He left the tavern the way he had entered, through the ground floor window, and vanished into the streets of Mülheim without leaving behind any evidence that the police of that era had the means to interpret. There were no fingerprints, there were no witnesses, there was only the body of a 9-year-old girl in a blood-soaked bed, and the anguished screams of her parents when they discovered her the following morning. The investigation that followed was immediate and intense, but ultimately misdirected. Suspicion fell almost at once upon Christine Klein's uncle, a man named Otto Klein, who had quarrelled publicly with the girl's father on the evening of the murder. The quarrel had been witnessed by several patrons of the tavern, and in the heated atmosphere of a community reeling from the horror of a child's murder, the uncle's angry words were quickly transmuted into evidence of guilt. Otto Klein was arrested, interrogated, and held in custody for an extended period, while the police attempted to build a case against him. The case was never built. The evidence was insufficient, the witnesses unreliable, the motive unclear. Otto Klein was eventually released, his name cleared by the absence of proof but stained by the lingering suspicion that attaches itself in small communities to anyone who has once been accused. The real killer was never identified. The case remained open, unsolved, a wound in the memory of Mülheim that would not close for nearly 2 decades. Peter Kürten, meanwhile, did something that would become a hallmark of his criminal behaviour, a detail so particular and so revealing that the psychiatrist Carl Berg would later describe it as one of the defining characteristics of Kürten's pathology. The day after the murder, Kürten returned to Mülheim. He did not return out of remorse or guilt or any desire to see whether the police were closing in on him. He returned because he wanted to witness the aftermath. He wanted to see the faces of the people who had discovered what he had done. He wanted to hear their voices, their shock, their horror, their grief. He walked to a tavern situated directly opposite the one in which he'd committed the murder, and he sat down and ordered a drink, and he listened. He listened to the patrons discussing the killing in tones of outrage and disbelief. He listened to the rumours that were already beginning to circulate, the accusations against the uncle, the theories about strangers and drifters and madmen. He absorbed it all with the quiet attentiveness of a man reading a favourable review of his own work, and the sensation it produced in him was, by his own account, one of the most intense pleasures he had ever experienced, a pleasure that rivaled and perhaps even surpassed the act of murder itself. In the weeks that followed, Kürten made several further trips to Mülheim, each time visiting the neighbourhood where the Klein family lived, each time finding reasons to linger in the vicinity of the tavern, each time feeding upon the grief and the fear that his act had produced. On at least one occasion, he visited the cemetery where Christine Klein had been buried and stood at her grave, and what he felt as he stood there looking down at the freshly turned earth was not sorrow, but satisfaction. The grave was proof. The grave was evidence that he had done what he had long imagined doing, that the fantasies of the prison cell had been made real, that the hunger inside him could be fed, and having fed it once, he knew with absolute certainty that he would feed it again. But the opportunity did not come immediately. 2 months after the murder of Christine Klein, Kürten broke into another house, this time in Düsseldorf, and encountered a 17-year-old girl sleeping in her bed. He attacked her, seizing her by the throat and strangling her into unconsciousness, but he did not kill her. Whether he was interrupted, or whether something in the circumstances of the attack failed to produce the response he craved is not clear. The girl survived, and the attack was not connected to the murder in Mülheim. Kürten vanished once more into the anonymous underworld of the Rhineland, and the brief, terrible window of violence that had opened in the spring and summer of 1913 closed again, sealed shut by circumstances that were beyond Kürten's control. The Great War came. In August of 1914, the armies of Europe mobilised and began the march toward a catastrophe that would consume 10 million lives and reshape the map of the world. Kürten, who had been conscripted into the army, and deserted almost immediately and was eventually captured and sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment that would keep him confined for the duration of the war and several years beyond. The iron door closed. The cell received him. The darkness wrapped itself around him like a familiar garment. And in that darkness, lying on his cot, staring at the ceiling, Peter Kürten returned to the only world in which he had ever felt truly alive. The world of his fantasies. The world in which the blood flowed and the victim screamed and the hunger was always, always satisfied. He replayed the murder of Christine Klein in his mind, over and over, refining each detail, savouring each sensation, holding the memory up to the light of his imagination, the way a jeweller holds a stone up to the light of a lamp, turning it slowly, examining each facet, each flaw, each point of brilliance. And he waited. The war raged, the empires crumbled, the world tore itself apart and put itself back together in a shape that no one recognised. And in a cell in a German prison, a man with pale eyes and a soft voice and the memory of a dead child's blood dripping onto a wooden floor lay still and patient and counted the days until the door would open again. The door would open. It always opened. And when it did, the man who walked through it would not be the same man who had entered. He would be older, harder, more certain of his purpose, more refined in his methods, and more desperate, with a desperation that was not born of fear but of appetite, to feel once more the thing that only blood could make him feel. The century had already produced horrors on a scale that dwarfed anything one man could accomplish. The trenches of the Western Front had swallowed a generation. The Spanish influenza had swept through the cities of Europe like the angel of death passing over Egypt. But the century was not finished. It had more to give. And in the darkness of a prison cell in the Rhineland, the next chapter of its cruelty was already being written, not in ink, but in the private, silent language of a mind that had long since left the human world behind. Chapter 5. The Quiet Years and the Return. The prison gates opened for the last time on a morning in 1921, and Peter Kürten stepped through them into a Germany that bore little resemblance to the country he had known before the war. The empire was gone, swept away by revolution and defeat and the collective exhaustion of a nation that had spent 4 years feeding its young men into the machinery of industrial warfare. In its place stood the Weimar Republic, a fragile experiment in democracy that had been born in humiliation and christened with the ink of a treaty that most Germans regarded not as a peace, but as a punishment. The Kaiser had fled to the Netherlands. The generals had retreated into sullen retirement. The streets of the great cities were full of men in threadbare uniforms, men who had survived the trenches only to find that the country for which they had fought no longer existed, or if it did exist, had no use for them. Inflation was beginning its slow, terrible ascent toward the madness of 1923, when a loaf of bread would cost a wheelbarrow full of banknotes and the savings of a lifetime could be rendered worthless between breakfast and supper. The old certainties had been erased, and in their place there was only confusion, resentment, and a pervasive sense that the ground beneath one's feet was no longer solid. Kürten was 38 years old. He had spent the better part of 2 decades behind bars, moving from one institution to another, with the grim regularity of a parcel being forwarded through a postal system that had lost track of its destination. His body bore the marks of those years, not in any dramatic or visible way, but in the pallor of his skin, the thinness of his frame, the careful, measured quality of his movements. The movements of a man who had learned to occupy the smallest possible space and to make the least possible noise. His mind, however, bore marks of a different kind, marks that no prison physician had detected and no parole board had thought to investigate. The years of solitary confinement had not broken Peter Kürten. They had perfected him. The fantasies that had sustained him through the darkness of his cells had grown into a detailed and comprehensive catalogue of violence, a library of imagined atrocities that he could access at will, each scenario meticulously planned, each victim carefully selected, each method of killing rehearsed and refined until it possessed the precision of a surgical procedure. He emerged from prison not as a reformed man, but as a man who had completed his preparations and was now ready to begin. But the beginning, when it came, was not immediate. Something in the circumstances of Kürten's release, or perhaps something in the man himself, imposed a period of delay, a stretch of years during which the monster that had been gestating in the darkness of the German penal system appeared to hibernate, to withdraw into some deep recess of Kürten's personality, while another, more presentable version of himself took the stage. He left the Rhineland and travelled to Altenburg, a small town in Thuringia, far from the industrial cities of the West and far from the streets and alleyways where his criminal history was known to the police. In Altenburg, Kürten did something that no one who knew his history would have predicted. He settled down. He found employment as a moulder in a local factory, the same trade his father had practiced in the foundries of Mülheim. He joined the trade union, he attended meetings, he spoke thoughtfully about the rights of workers and the injustices of the industrial system. He dressed neatly, kept his quarters clean, and conducted himself with a politeness and a quiet respectability that earned him the approval of his neighbours and the confidence of his employer. And he married. Her name was Auguste Schaff, and she was, by the standards of the time and the place, an unconventional woman. She had worked as a prostitute in her younger years, and had served a prison sentence for the killing of her former fiancé, a crime that the courts had treated with a leniency that suggested mitigating circumstances, though the precise nature of those circumstances has not survived in the historical record with any clarity. Auguste was a practical woman, hardened by experience, unsentimental in her expectations of what life could offer. She ran a small confectionery shop in Altenburg, and when Peter Kürten presented himself as a suitor, she saw in him not the monster that the psychiatrists of a later decade would identify, but a quiet, well-mannered man with steady employment and a willingness to share the burdens of domestic life. They married, and for a time, for a span of years that would later astonish those who studied the case, they lived together in what appeared to be a state of ordinary, unremarkable contentment. The years in Altenburg, roughly from 1921 to 1925, represent the most enigmatic period in Peter Kürten's life, the period that has generated the most debate among scholars of criminal history and the most uncertainty among those who have attempted to trace the precise trajectory of his descent into serial murder. On the surface, these were quiet years, years of work and domesticity and apparent normalcy. Kürten went to the factory each morning. He returned each evening. He ate supper with his wife. He read the newspaper. He attended union meetings. He did not, so far as the historical record can determine, commit any murders during this period. He did not, so far as anyone knew, engage in the kinds of violent behaviour that had characterised his earlier years. The monster, it seemed, had gone to sleep. But had it? The question has occupied criminologists for nearly a century, and the answer, insofar as one can be given, is almost certainly no. Kürten himself, in his later interviews with Karl Berg, made references to acts of violence committed during the Altenburg years, including assaults upon women and acts of arson, though the details he provided were vague and the specifics difficult to verify. What is more certain, because Kürten described it with the clinical precision that characterised his most reliable testimony, is that the fantasies continued unabated throughout this period. The marriage, the employment, the trade union meetings, the polite conversations with neighbours, all of these were the surface of a life beneath which the old current still ran, dark and swift and cold. Kürten had not changed. He had merely found a more effective disguise. The respectability of the Altenburg years was not a reformation. It was a performance, executed with the same careful attention to detail that Kürten brought to everything he did, and sustained by the knowledge that the performance was temporary, that it served a purpose, and that when the time came, it would be set aside as easily as a man sets aside a coat that he has borrowed for the evening. The time came in 1925. For reasons that are not entirely clear from the historical record, Kürten and his wife left Altenburg and returned to Düsseldorf, the city where Kürten's mother had settled after separating from his father, the city where Kürten himself had spent portions of his youth, the city that would become, within 4 years, the stage for the most terrifying series of murders that Germany had ever known. Kürten later told Berg that the return to Düsseldorf had felt like a homecoming of a particular and significant kind. Not a homecoming to a place of warmth or belonging, but a homecoming to a place of destiny. He described seeing the sunset over Düsseldorf on the evening of his arrival, a sunset that he said was the colour of blood, and he interpreted this as an omen, a sign that the city was calling him back to the work that only he could do. Whether this account is literally true or whether it is an example of the retrospective mythologizing that serial killers sometimes engage in when constructing narratives of their own crimes is impossible to determine. What is certain is that Peter Kürten returned to Düsseldorf in 1925, and that from the moment of his return, the trajectory of his life began to curve inexorably toward the events of 1929. The Düsseldorf to which Kürten returned was a city in transition, a city caught between the lingering trauma of the war and the hectic, feverish energy of the Weimar years. The hyperinflation of 1923 had been brought under control by the introduction of the Rentenmark, and a period of relative economic stability, the so-called Golden Twenties, had brought a measure of prosperity to the industrial cities of the Rhineland. Düsseldorf's factories were running again, its theatres and cabarets were open, its streets were busy with trams and automobiles and pedestrians, who moved with the purposeful haste of people who had places to be and things to do. But beneath the surface of this apparent recovery, the old wounds remained unhealed. Unemployment was still high, housing was still scarce, the gap between the wealthy and the poor was still vast and still visible, etched into the geography of the city itself, into the contrast between the grand avenues of the Altstadt and the cramped, soot-darkened streets of the working-class districts where families of 6 and 7 and 8 still shared single rooms in buildings that had not been repaired since before the war. Kürten found lodgings in the Mettmannerstrasse, a quiet street in a working-class neighbourhood, and he resumed his trade as a moulder, finding employment without great difficulty in a city whose factories were hungry for skilled labour. He and Auguste settled into a routine that, to their neighbours, appeared no different from the routines of the other working couples on the street. He went to work. She kept house. They attended the cinema on weekends. They exchanged pleasantries with the other tenants in their building. No one suspected anything. No one had any reason to suspect anything. Peter Kürten, to the outward eye, was a quiet, respectable man with a steady job and a wife who kept a tidy home. He was the sort of man one passed on the staircase without a second glance, the sort of man whose face one forgot before reaching the bottom step. But the return to Düsseldorf had awakened something in Kürten that the Altenburg years had merely suppressed. The city acted upon him like a drug, stimulating the appetites that marriage and employment had dulled but not extinguished. He began, in the months and years following his return, to engage in a pattern of behaviour that escalated slowly but steadily toward the catastrophe of 1929. He committed acts of arson, setting fires in barns and haystacks and abandoned buildings on the outskirts of the city, fires that he set not for profit or for concealment, but for the pure, intoxicating pleasure of watching the flames and listening to the screams of the people who came running to extinguish them. He committed petty crimes, thefts and burglaries that kept him in contact with the criminal underworld of Düsseldorf and provided him with the pocket money that his factory wages did not cover. And he committed with increasing frequency acts of sexual violence against women he encountered on the streets and in the parks of the city, assaults that were reported to the police but that were never connected to one another and never traced to the quiet moulder who lived on Mettmannerstrasse with his wife and his newspaper and his impeccable manners. The 4 years between Kürten's return to Düsseldorf in 1925 and the beginning of his murder spree in February of 1929 were years of preparation, though neither the police nor the public nor even Kürten's own wife had any awareness that a preparation was underway. Kürten was learning the city again, reacquainting himself with its geography, its rhythms, its vulnerabilities. He walked the streets at night, alone, studying the patterns of the police patrols, noting the locations where the street lamps were broken or absent, identifying the parks and the wooded areas and the patches of wasteland where a person could be attacked without being seen or heard. He observed the habits of the people who lived in the neighbourhoods he frequented, the times at which they left their homes and the times at which they returned, the routes they took, the shortcuts they favoured. He was mapping the city not as a tourist maps a city, with an eye for landmarks and attractions, but as a hunter maps a territory, with an eye for cover, for concealment, for the places where prey might be found alone and unprotected. Auguste Kürten, by all accounts, knew nothing of her husband's activities during these years. She worked, she kept house, she trusted Peter, or if she did not entirely trust him, she at least accepted the version of himself that he presented to her. The version that went to work each morning and came home each evening and read the newspaper and spoke quietly about the affairs of the day. The marriage was not passionate, but it was functional. And in the working-class world of 1920s Düsseldorf, functionality was often the most that a marriage could aspire to. Auguste had her own history, her own scars, her own reasons for not looking too closely at the man she'd married. She had survived poverty and prostitution and prison. She had learned, as Kürten had learned, that survival sometimes required a willingness to not ask questions, to not examine too carefully the surfaces of the life one had constructed, to accept the quiet and the routine and the daily bread and to leave the rest in darkness. The year 1928 passed without incident, or rather without any incident that would later be connected to the name Peter Kürten. The fires continued, the assaults continued, the quiet, methodical exploration of the city's dark places continued, and inside Peter Kürten, in the sealed chamber of his mind where the fantasies played out in their endless vivid loop, the pressure continued to build. The hunger that had first stirred in the dog-catcher's room in Mülheim, that had been fed by the murder of Christine Klein in 1913, that had been nourished through years of solitary confinement by fantasies of ever-increasing violence and specificity, had reached a point of saturation. It could no longer be contained by arson, or by assault, or by the elaborate theatre of domesticity that Kürten had constructed around himself. It demanded what it had always demanded. What it had demanded since the beginning. It demanded blood. And as the winter of 1928 gave way to the cold, wet February of 1929, Peter Kürten, the quiet moulder of Mettmanner Strasse, the polite neighbour, the dutiful husband, the man whose face no one remembered, began to give it what it wanted. The nights grew longer, the rain fell harder. The city of Düsseldorf drew its collar against the cold and hurried home through streets that were about to become the most dangerous in Germany. And somewhere in the darkness a man walked alone, his hands in the pockets of his overcoat, his footsteps silent on the wet cobblestones, his pale eyes scanning the empty pavements with the patient, unhurried gaze of a predator that has waited long enough and is now at last ready to feed. Chapter 6. February's first wound. The 3rd of February 1929 was a Monday. The sky over Düsseldorf was the colour of old pewter, low and heavy and featureless, pressing down upon the rooftops and the church spires and the bare branches of the linden trees that lined the boulevards of the Altstadt. The temperature hovered just above freezing. A thin, persistent drizzle had been falling since morning, the kind of rain that did not so much fall as hang in the air, saturating everything it touched with a cold, clammy dampness that seeped through wool and cotton and leather and settled against the skin like a second garment. The streets were quiet. The trams moved through the grey light with their windows fogged and their passengers huddled in silence. The factory whistles had sounded at 5 and the workers had dispersed into the dusk, walking quickly, heads down, eager to reach the warmth of their kitchens and the comfort of their evening meals. By 9 o'clock, the residential streets of the Flingen district were all but deserted. Apollonia Kuhn was 55 years old. She was a working woman, a woman of the district, a woman whose life had been shaped by the same forces that shaped the lives of all the women of her class, labour and thrift and endurance and the quiet, unacknowledged heroism of getting through each day without complaint. She was walking home to her apartment on Berthastrasse, a journey she had made hundreds of times before, a journey so familiar that her feet could have found the way without the guidance of her eyes. The route took her past a stretch of open ground, a field or a vacant lot, one of the many patches of wasteland that punctuated the residential streets of Flingen, remnants of buildings that had been demolished or plots that had never been developed, dark spaces in the urban fabric where the street lamps did not reach, and the shadows pooled like standing water. She did not see the man. She did not hear him. He came from behind, from the direction of the field, moving with a swiftness and a silence that gave her no time to turn, no time to cry out, no time to do anything but feel the first blow as it landed. He struck her with a pair of scissors, long-bladed and sharp, and he struck her not once but many times, stabbing at her face, her arms, her hands, the back of her head. The blows falling with a rapidity and a force that spoke not of calculation but of frenzy, though the frenzy, as would later become clear, was of a very particular kind. Apollonia Kuhn screamed. She screamed with the full force of her lungs, a sound that tore through the quiet of Berthestrasse and echoed off the wet facades of the surrounding buildings. And the man, whoever he was, whatever he was, stopped. He released her. He turned. He ran. He vanished into the darkness of the field as quickly and as silently as he had emerged from it, leaving Apollonia Kuhn bleeding on the pavement, her coat torn, her face streaming with blood, her screams subsiding into the ragged, gasping sobs of a woman who understood that she had just come within a breath of death. She survived. She was taken to hospital, a year where the physicians counted 18 stab wounds and administered 24 stitches. The police were called. A report was filed. Apollonia Kuhn described her attacker as a man of medium build, quiet, quick, dressed in dark clothing. She had not seen his face. She could not say whether she had ever encountered him before. The police took note, expressed their sympathy, and filed the report among the hundreds of other reports of assault and robbery that crossed their desks each month. Düsseldorf was a large city. Violence, particularly in the working-class districts, was not uncommon. A woman stabbed on a dark street by an unknown assailant was a matter for concern, certainly, but not for alarm. Not yet. 6 days later, on the 9th of February, the alarm began. Rosa Oehliger was 8 years old. She lived with her family in the Flingen district, in one of the narrow, crowded streets that radiated outward from the main thoroughfare like the spokes of a wheel. She was a child of the neighbourhood, known to the shopkeepers and the street sweepers and the other families who shared the cramped communal life of the district. She had gone out to play on the afternoon of the 8th of February and had not come home. Her parents had searched for her through the evening and into the night, knocking on the doors of neighbours, checking the playgrounds and the churchyards and the vacant lots where children sometimes gathered. They did not find her. The police were notified the following morning and a search was organised, and it was this search that led, on the afternoon of the 9th, me to the discovery of Rosa Oehliger's body beneath a hedge on a patch of scrubland in the Flingen district. The child had been stabbed 13 times. The wounds were concentrated on the torso and the head, and at least one wound had been directed at the most intimate region of her body, a detail that the police recorded with the clinical detachment of men who'd been trained to document what they found and leave the interpretation to others. An attempt had been made to burn the body with petrol, though the fire had not taken hold fully, and the child's clothing and skin bore the blackened, blistered marks of partial combustion. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was the stab wounds, that the burning had occurred after death, and that there was evidence of a sexual nature that indicated the attacker had achieved a state of arousal during or immediately after the killing. The weapon, the examiner concluded, had been a pair of scissors. The discovery of Rosa Oehliger's body sent a shockwave through the Flingen district that was felt within hours across the entire city. A child had been murdered. A child had been stabbed and burned and left beneath a hedge like a piece of refuse. The newspapers, which in the Weimar Republic operated with a freedom and a sensationalism that would have been unthinkable under the Kaiser, seized upon the story with an avidity that reflected both the horror of the crime and the appetite of a public that had grown accustomed, in the chaotic years of the Republic, to a steady diet of scandal and outrage. The headlines were large and black and urgent. The details were reported with a frankness that spared the reader nothing, and in the homes and the taverns and the factories of Düsseldorf, people began to talk, to speculate, to wonder what kind of person could do such a thing to a child, and whether such a person might still be walking among them. 4 days later, on the 13th of February, the wondering intensified. Rudolf Scheer was 53 years old, a mechanic by trade, a man of the working class, a man whose life had been lived entirely within the orbit of the industrial Rhineland. He was found dead in the early hours of the morning on a street in the Flingen district, not far from the place where Apollonia Kuhn had been attacked, and not far from the place where Rosa Oehliger's body had been discovered. He had been stabbed 20 times. The wounds were distributed across his body with a savagery that suggested either a sustained and furious assault, or an attacker who had continued to stab long after the victim had ceased to resist. The weapon, once again, appeared to be a pair of scissors. There were no witnesses. There was no apparent motive. Rudolf Scheer had not been robbed. He had not been involved in any known dispute. He had simply been walking home through the dark streets of Flingen, as he had walked home 1,000 times before, and someone had stepped out of the darkness and killed him. The police of Düsseldorf were now confronted with a pattern that they could not ignore and could not easily explain. 3 attacks in 10 days, all within the same district, all committed at night. All involving a bladed weapon that appeared to be a pair of scissors, all directed at victims who had been chosen, so far as the investigators could determine, entirely at random. The victims had nothing in common. Apollonia Kuhn was a middle-aged woman. Rosa Oliger was a child. Rudolf Scheer was a middle-aged man. They did not know one another. They did not frequent the same establishments. They did not belong to the same social circles. The only thing that connected them was geography and method. The fact that they had all been attacked in the Flingen district and that they had all been stabbed with the same type of weapon. This was enough. The investigators, led by the Düsseldorf criminal police, began to work upon the hypothesis that a single perpetrator was responsible for all 3 attacks. A hypothesis that carried with it an implication so disturbing that the police were reluctant at first to voice it publicly. If one person had committed all 3 attacks, then that person was not a robber, not a man settling a grudge, not a jealous husband or a rival in business. That person was something else entirely. That person was killing for reasons that the ordinary categories of criminal motivation could not accommodate. The investigation expanded. Detectives were assigned. Patrols were increased in the Flingen district. Informants were contacted. The criminal underworld of Düsseldorf was shaken for information. But the Flingen attacker, as the press had begun to call him, had left behind almost nothing in the way of physical evidence. No weapon had been recovered. No fingerprints had been found. No witness had seen the attacker's face clearly enough to provide a useful description. The police were working in the dark, quite literally, pursuing a criminal who operated in the unlit margins of the city, and who appeared to vanish, after each attack, as completely as smoke dissolving in the rain. Peter Kürten, meanwhile, returned to his routine. He went to the factory, he came home, he ate supper with Auguste, he read the newspaper, paying particular attention to the reports of the Flingen attacks, which he followed with an interest that his wife, had she noticed it, might have attributed to the same morbid fascination that gripped every other resident of Düsseldorf. He did not draw attention to himself. He did not behave in any way that might have aroused suspicion. He was, as he had always been, the quietest man on the street, the man whose footsteps made no sound, the man whose presence left no impression, the man who could sit in a room full of people discussing the murders and contribute nothing to the conversation but a nod and a murmur and a look of quiet concern that was indistinguishable from the quiet concern on every other face. But inside, in the sealed chamber where the hunger lived, Peter Kürten was exultant. He had done it. He had done what the fantasies had promised. He had killed, and the killing had produced in him a sensation so overwhelming, so total, so far beyond anything that the torture of animals or the setting of fires or the elaborations of his prison fantasies had ever achieved, that he knew, with the certainty of a man who has found his vocation, that he would do it again. The only question was when. The February attacks had been impulsive, driven by the pressure of an appetite that could no longer be contained. The next attacks, he knew, would be different. They would be planned. They would be deliberate. They would be conducted with the patience and the precision that he had spent decades cultivating, and they would not stop until something stopped him. After the frenzy of February, Kürten withdrew. The spring and summer months of 1929 passed without a fatal attack that could be attributed to the Flingen assailant. The police investigation continued, but with diminishing urgency. New crimes demanded attention. New crises erupted. The political situation in Germany was deteriorating rapidly, the economy teetering, the extremist parties gaining strength, the streets of the major cities becoming arenas for clashes between communists and nationalists that sometimes turned deadly. In this atmosphere of generalised anxiety and instability, the memory of the February attacks began to recede, not from the consciousness of the Flingen residents who had lived through them, but from the headlines of the newspapers and the priorities of the police. Perhaps the attacker had moved on. Perhaps he had been arrested for some other crime. Perhaps he was dead. The city exhaled cautiously, tentatively, and turned its attention to the other threats that pressed upon it from every side. But Peter Kürten had not moved on. He had not been arrested. He was not dead. He was waiting, with the same inhuman patience that had sustained him through years of solitary confinement. Then, for the moment when the city's guard had dropped low enough, when the nights had grown long enough and dark enough, when the hunger inside him had built to a pressure that demanded release. That moment would come in August, and when it came, the city of Düsseldorf would learn that the February attacks had not been the end of something. They had been the beginning. Chapter 7. The Summer of Scissors and Hammers. August came to Düsseldorf with a heaviness that pressed itself upon the city like a hand upon a sleeping chest. The days were long and hot, the air thick with the exhaust of the factories and the dust of the unpaved streets on the outskirts of the residential districts. The Rhine moved sluggishly between its banks, brown and warm and slow, and the parks along its shores were crowded in the evenings with families seeking relief from the heat of their apartments, children running barefoot through the grass, couples sitting on benches beneath the linden trees, old men smoking their pipes and watching the barges slide past in the fading light. It was the kind of summer that invited people outdoors, that drew them from the close airless rooms of the tenement buildings into the open spaces of the city, into the parks and the gardens and the wooded areas that bordered the residential districts. It was, in other words, the kind of summer that placed people exactly where Peter Kürten wanted them. The first murder of the August campaign occurred on the 11th of the month. Maria Hahn was a young woman, a domestic worker, 26 years old, with the plain, an open face and the sturdy build of a woman raised in the agricultural regions east of the Rhine. She had come to Düsseldorf in search of employment, one of the thousands of young women who drifted each year from the countryside to the cities, drawn by the promise of wages and independence, and a life less circumscribed than the one they had left behind. She had met Peter Kürten on the 8th of August, at Hansaplatz, one of the public squares in the centre of the city, where unemployed workers and domestic servants gathered in the hope of finding casual employment or, failing that, company. Kürten had been charming. He had been polite. He had spoken to Maria with the quiet attentiveness of a man who listened more than he talked, who seemed genuinely interested in her circumstances, who offered sympathy without condescension and assistance without expectation. They had arranged to meet again the following Sunday. On Sunday, the 11th, they met as planned and travelled together to the Neanderthal, a wooded valley to the east of Düsseldorf that was a popular destination for day trippers and hikers. They walked among the trees. They stopped at several restaurants along the way. They ate and drank and talked, and Maria Hahn, by all reasonable inference, felt safe. She had found a companion, a man who was gentle and courteous, a man who had shown her kindness in a city where kindness was not always easy to find. The afternoon passed pleasantly. The light began to fade. The other hikers began to make their way back toward the tram stops and the railway stations, and the woods grew quieter and darker and emptier with each passing quarter of an hour. Peter Kürten did not take Maria Hahn back to the tram. He led her deeper into the woods, into a place where the trees grew close together and the undergrowth was thick, and the sounds of the city could no longer be heard. What happened there, in the gathering darkness of a summer evening in the Neanderthal, was an act of violence so extreme and so prolonged that the details, as Kürten later recounted them to the psychiatrist Karl Berg, constitute some of the most harrowing testimony in the annals of criminal history. Kürten attacked Maria Hahn with a knife. He stabbed her repeatedly. He violated her. He continued to inflict wounds upon her body long after she had lost consciousness, long after the last breath had left her lungs, long after the blood had ceased to flow with the force that he found so stimulating. When he was finished, he buried her body in a shallow grave at the edge of the woodland and covered it with branches and leaves and loose earth. Then he walked back to Düsseldorf, boarded a tram, and went home to his wife. Maria Hahn's body would not be discovered for months. She had no family in Düsseldorf. She had no employer who would notice her absence. She was one of the invisible women of the Weimar Republic, a migrant worker without roots or connections, the kind of person whose disappearance could go unremarked for weeks, or months, or even years. Kürten knew this. He had chosen her precisely because of it. And yet, as the weeks passed and no report of the discovery of a body in the Neanderthal appeared in the newspapers, Kürten grew impatient. He wanted the discovery. He wanted the headlines. He wanted the shock and the horror and the public spectacle that the finding of a murdered woman's body would produce. The killing itself, he had learned, was only half of the pleasure. The other half was the aftermath, the ripple of fear that spread outward from each crime like a stone dropped into still water, the knowledge that an entire city was afraid of him, even though they did not know his name or his face or anything about him except the terrible things he had done. But Kürten did not wait for the discovery of Maria Hahn to resume his campaign. Less than 2 weeks after her murder, on the evening of the 23rd of August, he struck again, and this time the victims were children. Gertrude Hammacher was 5 years old. Her foster sister, Louise Lenzen, was 14. They lived together in a household in the Flingen district, and on the evening of the 23rd they were sent on an errand to a local fair that had been set up on the outskirts of the neighbourhood. The errand should have been a simple one, a walk of a few hundred metres through streets that were familiar and well lit and populated by neighbours who knew the children by name. They did not return. When their foster parents raised the alarm later that evening, a search was mounted, and the following morning the bodies of both children were discovered in adjoining allotment gardens on the edge of the district. Louise Lenzen had been strangled, and her throat had been cut. Gertrude Hammacher had been strangled and stabbed. The brutality of the attacks, directed as they were against children, produced a reaction in the city of Düsseldorf that dwarfed anything the February attacks had provoked. The newspapers devoted their front pages to the murders. The police issued urgent appeals for information. The residents of the Flingen district organised patrols of their own streets, men walking in groups after dark, armed with sticks and lanterns, searching for any sign of the attacker who had taken 2 children from their midst. Parents refused to let their children out of sight. Women refused to walk alone after nightfall. The city, which had begun to forget the horrors of February, was now plunged into a state of fear that bordered on collective hysteria. And still, the attacks continued. The very next day, the 24th of August, Kürten stabbed another woman, Gertrude Schulte, on a country path near the town of Neuss, a short distance from Düsseldorf. Schulte survived, badly wounded, and was able to give police a description of her attacker, a description that, in its vagueness, could have applied to half the men in the Rhineland. The description was circulated. It produced nothing. Then came September. On the 30th of the month, the body of Ida Reuter was found on the Rhine meadows outside Düsseldorf. She was a domestic servant, 31 years old, and she had been beaten to death with a hammer, her skull fractured by repeated blows delivered with a force that the medical examiner described as extraordinary. The hammer was a new weapon in the attacker's arsenal. The scissors had been used in February. The knife had been used in August. Now a hammer. The variety of weapons, combined with the variety of victims, men and women, adults and children, young and old, created a problem for the investigators that went beyond the merely practical. It created a problem of comprehension. The police could not understand what kind of person would attack so many different types of victims with so many different types of weapons, because the assumption that guided their investigation, the assumption that guided all criminal investigations of that era, was that murderers operated within recognisable patterns, that they chose victims who shared certain characteristics, that they favoured certain methods and certain locations, and that by identifying these patterns, the police could narrow the field of suspects and eventually identify the perpetrator. Peter Kürten shattered this assumption. His victims had nothing in common except their vulnerability. His weapons were chosen for convenience, not for preference. His hunting ground was the entire city of Düsseldorf and its surrounding countryside. He was, in the language of a later century, a serial killer of a type that the criminal science of 1929 had no framework to understand and no method to apprehend. October brought more horror. On the 11th, a young woman named Elisabeth Dorier was attacked on Graf Adolfstrasse, one of the busiest streets in the centre of Düsseldorf, after leaving a cinema. She was struck 8 times with a hammer, blows that fractured her skull and left her lying in a pool of blood on the pavement. A trail of blood led from the scene of the attack to the place where she had been found, and the police, following this trail, were able to reconstruct the sequence of events with a precision that brought them no closer to identifying the attacker. Elisabeth Dorier was taken to hospital, where she lingered for some days before dying without having regained consciousness. She was 22 years old. Later that month, on the 25th of October, Kürten attacked 2 more women with a hammer on separate occasions on the same evening, striking each of them from behind as they walked through dimly lit streets on the outskirts of the city. Both women survived, though both suffered serious head injuries. The police, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of attacks, struggled to connect each new incident to the others, to determine which assaults were the work of the same perpetrator and which were unrelated, and to distinguish between the crimes of the Flingen attacker and the ordinary violence of a city of 500,000 people in a time of economic and political turmoil. And then, on the 7th of November, Peter Kürten committed the last murder of his 1929 campaign, and it was, by any measure, the most terrible of all. Gertrude Albermann was 5 years old. She lived in the Flingen district, the same district where Rosa Oeliger had been found in February, the same district where Gertrude Hammaker and Louise Lenzen had been murdered in August. She was approached by a man on the street, a man who spoke to her kindly, who took her hand, who led her away from the safety of the populated streets and into a stretch of deserted allotment gardens near a factory wall. There, in the failing light of a November afternoon, Peter Kürten strangled the child and then stabbed her with a pair of scissors, first once in the temple, as was his habit, and then 34 further times in the chest and the head. He left her body face down in a pile of rubble and nettles and walked away. 2 days later, a communist newspaper in Düsseldorf received a letter. Inside the letter was a map. The map showed 2 locations. One was the place where Gertrude Albermann's body could be found, a body that had already been discovered by the police earlier that day. The other was the place where Maria Hahn's body had been buried months earlier in the Neanderthal. The handwriting on the map matched the handwriting on a previous anonymous letter that the police had received in October, a letter that had claimed responsibility for the murder of Maria Hahn and had described the location of her grave in terms that only the killer could have known. The police followed the map to the Neanderthal. They dug where the map indicated, and there, beneath a shallow layer of earth and rotting leaves, they found what remained of Maria Hahn. The city of Düsseldorf had reached its breaking point. The discovery of Maria Hahn's body, combined with the murder of Gertrude Albermann and the accumulating toll of the preceding months, produced a state of public terror that the newspapers of the period described in terms that bordered on the apocalyptic. The police headquarters was inundated with letters, more than 13,000 by the end of the year, from citizens who believed they had seen the attacker, who believed they knew the attacker, who believed they themselves were the attacker. More than 9,000 individuals were formally interviewed. A list of potential suspects grew to include more than 900,000 names. Vigilante groups patrolled the streets. Women armed themselves with hatpins and small knives. Parents walked their children to school and back, never letting them out of arm's reach. The nightlife of Düsseldorf, the cabarets and the dance halls and the cinemas that had been the glory of the Weimar years, withered and died as people refused to leave their homes after dark. And through it all, through the panic and the headlines and the police dragnets and the vigilante patrols, Peter Kürten walked the streets of Düsseldorf unmolested and undetected, a quiet man in a dark overcoat, a man with a factory job and a wife and a tidy apartment on Mettmanner Strasse, a man who read the newspaper each morning and followed the reports of the Vampire of Düsseldorf with an interest that no one around him found remarkable. He had killed 9 people. He had attacked dozens more. He had terrorised an entire city for the better part of a year. And not a single person in Düsseldorf, not a detective, not a neighbour, not the wife who slept beside him each night, had the faintest idea that the monster they were searching for was already among them, had always been among them, and was, even now, sitting quietly in his kitchen, drinking his coffee and reading about himself in the morning paper. The winter closed in, the nights grew long, the city held its breath and waited for the next attack, and the next, and the next. But the next attack, when it came, would not be a murder. It would be a mistake. A small, almost insignificant mistake. The kind of mistake that a man who had evaded detection for decades might make when he had grown too confident, too comfortable, too certain that the darkness would always protect him. And that mistake would begin with a young woman stepping off a train at Düsseldorf station, alone and afraid, and looking for a place to sleep. Chapter 8. The Letter That Went Astray. The spring of 1930 arrived in Düsseldorf without warmth, without relief, without any of the gentle reassurances that the turning of the season is supposed to bring. The trees along the Rhine put forth their leaves with the same mechanical obedience that they exhibited every year, but the people who walked beneath them did so with their eyes cast downward, and their steps quickened, as though the green canopy overhead offered no shelter from the thing that stalked their city. The winter had passed without a fatal attack, but the winter had not passed without violence. Between February and May of 1930, Peter Kürten had committed a series of assaults upon women in the streets and parks of Düsseldorf. attacks involving hammers and strangulation attempts that had left 10 victims injured but alive. Each survivor had been able to provide the police with a description of her attacker, and the descriptions, when assembled and compared, began to produce a composite portrait that was at once detailed enough to be useful and vague enough to be maddening. The man was of medium height. He was of medium build. He was neatly dressed. He was polite. He was quiet. He had the manner of a gentleman. He could have been anyone. He could have been no one. He could have been the man sitting across from you on the tram, reading his newspaper, adjusting his hat, offering you a courteous nod as he rose to disembark at his stop. The police investigation had grown into the largest criminal inquiry in the history of the Rhineland. Detectives had been seconded from surrounding cities. Additional officers had been assigned to patrol the most vulnerable districts. Chief Inspector Ernst Gennat, one of the most experienced homicide investigators in Germany, had been brought in from Berlin to assist the Düsseldorf criminal police in their search for the man the newspapers had christened the Vampire. Gennat was a formidable figure, a man of immense physical bulk and equally immense professional reputation, a pioneer in the systematic collection and analysis of criminal evidence who had been instrumental in solving some of the most notorious murder cases of the Weimar era. He brought with him methods that were advanced for their time, methods involving the careful correlation of witness testimony, the mapping of crime scenes, the analysis of wound patterns, the construction of timelines that plotted the movements of victims and suspect alike across the geography of the city. But even Gennat, with all his experience and all his resources, was struggling. The Vampire of Düsseldorf was not merely elusive, he was incomprehensible. He defied the categories, he broke the patterns. He attacked men and women, adults and children, the young and the old, using scissors and knives and hammers, in parks and on streets and in wooded areas, at dusk and at midnight, and in the small hours of the morning. There was no profile to construct, no pattern to follow, no thread to pull that might unravel the knot of seemingly random violence that had been tightening around the city for more than a year. The citizens of Düsseldorf, meanwhile, had settled into a state of chronic, low-grade terror that had become, by the spring of 1930, an inescapable feature of daily life. Conversations in the taverns and the factories and the bread queues circled endlessly around the same questions. Who was the vampire? Where would he strike next? Why could the police not catch him? Theories multiplied. Some believed the killer was a madman who had escaped from an asylum. Others believed he was a foreigner, a Pole or a Czech, someone from beyond the borders of the respectable German working class. Still others believed there was more than one killer, that the sheer variety of victims and methods could not be the work of a single pair of hands. An innocent man named Johann Stausberg had already been arrested, tried and committed to an asylum for 2 of the early murders, a miscarriage of justice that would not be corrected until Kürten himself confessed to the crimes. The city was chasing shadows, grasping at explanations that offered the comfort of comprehensibility in the face of something that refused to be comprehended. It was into this atmosphere of exhausted fear and frustrated investigation that a young woman named Maria Budlik stepped off a train at Düsseldorf Hauptbahnhof on the 14th of May, 1930. She was 20 years old. She had travelled from Cologne in search of employment and lodgings, one of the countless young women who moved between the cities of the Rhineland in those years, following rumours of work the way migrating birds follow the promise of warmer air. She was alone. She had no contacts in Düsseldorf. She had no address to go to, no employer expecting her, no friend or relative who knew that she had arrived. She stood on the platform of the station in the early evening light, a small figure with a suitcase looking around at the unfamiliar city with the wary, uncertain expression of a person who has taken a step and is not yet sure whether the ground beneath her foot is solid. A man approached her on the platform. He was friendly. He was solicitous. He offered to direct her to a hostel where she might find a room for the night. Maria Budlik, who had been raised in a world where the kindness of strangers was sometimes the only kindness available, agreed to follow him. They walked together through the streets near the station, the man leading, the woman following, the distance between them narrowing as they moved away from the lights and the crowds of the Hauptbahnhof, and into the quieter, less populated streets that radiated outward from the city centre. But as the streets grew darker and the buildings grew shabbier, and the man began to steer her toward the entrance of a park, Maria Budlik felt the first stirrings of unease. She slowed her pace. She questioned the direction they were taking. The man insisted. She resisted. The conversation became an argument. The argument became a confrontation, and the confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of a second man, a man who appeared from the darkness of a side street and asked, in a tone of calm concern, whether the young woman was being bothered by her companion. Maria Budlik nodded. The first man, clearly discomfited by the presence of a witness, turned and walked away without a word. The second man, the man who had come to her rescue, offered the shaken young woman his assistance. He was polite, he was well-spoken, he was dressed neatly. He introduced himself and suggested that she come to his apartment, which was nearby, where she could rest and have something to eat before he helped her find suitable lodgings. Maria Budlik, grateful for the intervention, and reassured by the man's courteous demeanour, agreed. The man who had come to Maria Budlik's aid was Peter Kürten. He took her to his apartment at 71 Mettmannerstrasse. The apartment was clean and orderly, the home of a respectable working man, with a table and chairs and a stove and the small, modest comforts of a household maintained with care. August Kürten was not at home. Peter offered Maria bread and a glass of milk. She ate. She drank. She began to relax, to feel safe, to believe that she'd been fortunate in her encounter with this kind and attentive stranger. And then, as the evening deepened and the light from the window faded, Maria Budlik understood, with a suddenness that must have struck her like a blow, what the man's kindness had been concealing. Kürten made his intentions clear. He wanted her body. Maria told him, plainly and directly, that she was not interested in such an arrangement. She asked him to help her find a hotel, as he had promised. Kürten agreed. He was calm. He was accommodating. He suggested they take a tram to Worringerplatz, from which she could easily reach a hostel. Maria consented, relieved by his apparent acceptance of her refusal. They boarded the tram together and rode through the darkening streets of Düsseldorf, two figures among many, unremarkable, unnoticed. But Kürten did not lead Maria Budlik to a hostel. He led her, with the patient, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this before, away from the tram stop and into the Grafenberg woods, a stretch of dense woodland on the northern outskirts of the city where the street lamps ended and the darkness was absolute. In the woods, Kürten seized Maria Budlik by the throat. He forced her to the ground. He assaulted her. Maria screamed, and the scream, which in the open air of the Flingen district might have brought neighbours running, was swallowed by the trees and the darkness and the vast indifference of the forest. But something in the scream, or something in the circumstances of the attack, produced in Kürten a response that deviated from his established pattern. He released his grip on her throat. He stopped. He stood up. He looked down at the young woman lying on the ground beneath him, and he asked her, in a voice that witnesses would later describe as eerily calm, whether she could remember the address of his apartment. Maria Budlik, with the desperate ingenuity of a woman fighting for her survival, told him that she could not remember. It was a lie. She remembered the address perfectly. She remembered the number on the door, the name of the street, the layout of the rooms. But she understood, with an instinct that no amount of formal education could have sharpened, that the answer to Kürten's question would determine whether she lived or died, and she chose the answer that she believed would keep her alive. Kürten appeared to accept her response. He helped her to her feet. He brushed the dirt and the leaves from her clothing. He led her out of the woods and back toward the tram stop, and he let her go. Maria Budlik walked away from Peter Kürten in the darkness of a May evening, trembling, bruised, violated, but alive. She was the last person he would attack as a free man. Maria Budlik did not go to the police. She was frightened, disoriented, ashamed, unsure of what had happened to her, and unsure of whether anyone would believe her if she tried to explain it. Instead, she did what many women of her era and her circumstances did when they had been subjected to violence by a man. She wrote a letter. She addressed the letter to a friend, a woman named Frau Bruckner, and in the letter she described what had happened to her on the evening of the 14th of May, the man at the station, the apartment on Mettmannerstrasse, the journey to the woods, the assault. She described the man, she described the apartment, she described the route they had taken. And then she sealed the letter, addressed the envelope, and posted it. But Maria Budlik made a mistake. She addressed the envelope incorrectly. The letter did not reach Frau Bruckner. It reached a different woman entirely. A woman who opened it, read its contents, and was so disturbed by what she read that she took the letter directly to the police. The letter arrived at the Düsseldorf Criminal Police Headquarters on the 19th of May. It was read by Chief Inspector Gennert. Gennert, who had spent months immersed in the details of the vampire investigation, recognised immediately that the events described in the letter might be connected to the case he was trying to solve. The description of the man, the method of approach, the escalation from courtesy to violence, the assault in a wooded area, all of these were consistent with the pattern that the investigators had been painstakingly assembling from the testimony of the survivors of the vampire's attacks. Gennert contacted Maria Budlik and arranged to interview her. Maria Budlik told Gennert everything. She described the man in detail. She described his apartment in detail. She described the route they had taken from the station to the apartment and from the apartment to the woods. And she told Gennert what she had lied to Kürten about. She remembered the address. She remembered it perfectly. 71 Mettmanner Strasse. Gennert and Budlik went to the address together. The landlady of the building admitted Budlik to the room, and Budlik confirmed that this was the apartment in which she had been given bread and milk on the evening of the 14th of May. The landlady confirmed the name of the tenant, Peter Kürten. The police had a name, they had an address, they had a witness who could identify the occupant. For the first time in more than a year, the investigation had a direction. But Peter Kürten was not at home when Gennert and Budlik visited the apartment. He had returned to the building shortly after their visit, and as he climbed the stairs to his room, he had seen Budlik and a man he did not recognise in the communal hallway. He understood immediately what had happened. He understood that Budlik had remembered his address, that she had led the police to his door, and that the careful, patient, decades-long concealment of his true nature was about to come to an end. He turned and left the building without being seen. What Peter Kürten did next was, by any standard, one of the most extraordinary acts in the history of criminal behaviour. He did not flee the city. He did not attempt to destroy evidence. He did not construct an alibi or prepare a defence. Instead, he went to his wife. He found Auguste, and he sat her down, and he told her the truth. He told her that he was the Vampire of Düsseldorf. He told her that he had murdered 9 people. He told her that he had committed dozens of other attacks. He described the killings in detail. He described the weapons he had used. He described the victims he had chosen. He told her everything, calmly, methodically, without emotion, in the same quiet, measured voice that his neighbours knew, the voice of a man discussing the weather or the price of bread. Auguste Kürten's reaction to this confession has been the subject of considerable speculation. She was, by all accounts, horrified. She was disbelieving. She was afraid. But she was also, and this was the aspect of her response that Kürten had anticipated and relied upon, a practical woman. Kürten told her that there was a substantial reward being offered for information leading to the capture of the vampire. He told her that if she went to the police and turned him in, she would receive this reward, and the money would provide her with financial security after his inevitable arrest and execution. He urged her to do this. He insisted upon it. He presented it not as a betrayal, but as a gift, the last and perhaps the only gift he had ever given her, a final act of devotion from a husband who had concealed from his wife the most fundamental fact of his existence. Auguste Kürten went to the police. She told them that her husband was the Vampire of Düsseldorf. She told them where he could be found, and on the 24th of May 1930, in a street near the Rochuskirche, a church in the centre of Düsseldorf where Kürten had arranged to meet Auguste for what he knew would be the last time, Peter Kürten was surrounded by armed police officers. He was carrying a weapon. For a moment it appeared that he might resist. Then he looked at the number of officers arrayed against him, and he raised his hands and he surrendered. The most extensive manhunt in the history of the German police was over. The Vampire of Düsseldorf had a face, a name, and an address on Mettmanner Strasse. The news of Kürten's arrest spread through Düsseldorf with the speed of a fire through dry timber. Within hours, the city that had lived in terror for more than a year knew the name and the face of the man who had terrorised it. The newspapers printed his photograph, a mugshot taken at the police headquarters, showing a man of unremarkable appearance, neatly groomed, clean-shaven, with a high forehead and pale eyes, and an expression of such composed indifference that it seemed less like the face of a murderer than the face of a bank clerk or a schoolteacher or a civil servant awaiting the next item on his agenda. The contrast between the banality of the face and the enormity of the crimes it represented was so stark, so disorienting, that many of Kürten's neighbours and acquaintances refused to believe it. Not Peter, not the quiet man from Mettmannerstrasse, not the man who always tipped his hat, not the man who always said good morning. There must be a mistake. There must be another explanation. But there was no mistake, and there was no other explanation. And as the days passed, and the details of Kürten's confession began to emerge from behind the closed doors of the police headquarters, the city of Düsseldorf was forced to confront a truth that was perhaps more frightening than any of the individual horrors that the vampire had committed. The monster had not looked like a monster. The monster had looked like everyone else. Chapter 9. The Cage in the Courtroom. The trial of Peter Kürten began on the 13th of April 1931 in the Criminal Court of Düsseldorf, a building of sombre stone and high windows that had been constructed in an era when the architecture of justice was intended to inspire awe and obedience in equal measure. The courtroom was large, but it was not large enough. The press galleries were overflowing, and journalists from across Germany, from across Europe, from as far away as the United States and Japan, had converged upon Düsseldorf to witness the trial of the man whose crimes had become an international sensation. The public galleries were packed with citizens who had queued for hours, some since before dawn, for the chance to sit in the same room as the vampire and see with their own eyes the face of the man who had held their city hostage for the better part of 2 years. The families of the victims were present, seated in rows that had been reserved for them near the front of the courtroom, their faces drawn and pale and fixed with an expression of grief and rage that no verdict, however severe, could adequately address. And at the centre of it all, as in a specially constructed iron cage that rose to shoulder height and was flanked on every side by armed police officers, sat Peter Kürten. He was 47 years old. He was neatly dressed in a well-tailored suit. His hair was combed. His posture was upright. His expression was calm, attentive, even faintly interested, as though he were attending a lecture on a subject that he found moderately engaging. His feet were shackled. The cage had been built specifically for this trial, designed to protect the defendant from physical attack by the relatives of his victims, several of whom had made public threats against his life in the months since his arrest. The cage was an extraordinary measure, unprecedented in the annals of Düsseldorf's criminal court, and its presence in the courtroom served as a visible reminder of the extraordinary nature of the crimes that had brought Peter Kürten before the law. The presiding judge was a man named Rose, a jurist of long experience and severe demeanour, who conducted the proceedings with a formality and a precision that reflected both the gravity of the charges and the intensity of the public scrutiny under which the trial was being conducted. The charges were read aloud at the opening of the proceedings: 9 counts of murder, 7 counts of attempted murder. The names of the victims were recited in the order in which they had been attacked: Apollonia Kuhn, Rosa Oliger, Rudolf Scheer, Maria Hahn, Gertrud Hammacher, Luisa Lenzen, Ida Reuter, Elisabeth Dorier, Gertrud Albermann. Each name was spoken clearly, distinctly, with a deliberateness that gave to each syllable the weight of an accusation and the solemnity of a memorial. In the public gallery, the families of the dead listened to the names of their loved ones and wept, and Peter Kürten, in his iron cage, listened to the same names and did not. Kürten had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. This was the strategy that his defence counsel, a lawyer whose unenviable task it was to mount a defence for the most hated man in Germany, had determined offered the best chance, or perhaps the least hopeless chance, of saving his client from the guillotine. The argument was not without a certain logic. Kürten's crimes had been so extreme, so varied, so apparently motiveless, that the defence could plausibly contend that no sane person could have committed them, that the sheer volume and savagery of the attacks pointed not to criminal intent, but to a diseased mind operating beyond the boundaries of rational choice. The prosecution, however, was prepared for this argument, and they countered it with a weight of evidence that left the defence's position in ruins. The prosecution's case was built upon the foundation of Kürten's own confession. In the months between his arrest in May of 1930 and the commencement of his trial in April of 1931, Kürten had been subjected to extensive interrogation by the police and had provided a confession of staggering comprehensiveness. He had admitted to 68 separate criminal acts, including the 9 murders and 31 attempted murders. He had described each crime in detail, providing information about the locations, the weapons, the victims, and the methods of attack that could be verified by the physical evidence and the testimony of the survivors. He had demonstrated, in the course of these interrogations, a memory of remarkable precision, recalling dates and times and street names and the positions of bodies with an accuracy that the investigating officers found both impressive and deeply unsettling. He had not merely confessed, he had narrated, with the fluency and the relish of a man telling a story that he had been eager to tell for a very long time. The prosecution used this confession to devastating effect. They argued that the detail and the precision of Kürten's testimony demonstrated not insanity, but a high degree of planning, forethought, and self-awareness. A madman, the prosecution contended, does not select his victims with care. A madman does not vary his weapons to avoid detection. A madman does not return to the scenes of his crimes to observe the reactions of the police and the public. A madman does not send maps to newspapers identifying the locations of buried bodies. A madman does not confess to his wife and instruct her to claim the reward for his capture. These were the acts of a rational, calculating, and fully conscious mind, a mind that understood the nature and the consequences of its actions and chose to commit them anyway. Peter Kürten, for his part, conducted himself throughout the trial with a composure that seemed designed to confirm the prosecution's argument. He sat in his cage with the stillness of a man at rest, his hands folded, his eyes moving slowly across the faces of the judges, the lawyers, the journalists, the families of his victims. When called upon to testify, he rose and spoke in a voice that was clear, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. He described his crimes with the same clinical detachment that he had displayed during his police interrogations, recounting acts of extraordinary violence in language that was precise, measured, and free of any trace of remorse or distress. He explained, when asked about his motives, that his primary compulsion had been one of a nature that the court was reluctant to discuss in explicit terms, and that the number and severity of the wounds he inflicted upon each victim had been determined by the length of time required to satisfy that compulsion. He stated that the sight of his victim's blood had been the essential element of his gratification, and that without it, the acts of violence would have held no interest for him. He also offered an explanation for his crimes that went beyond the merely personal. He told the court that he had been motivated in part by a desire to strike back at a society that he regarded as oppressive and unjust. He pointed to his childhood, to the brutality of his father, to the squalor of the tenement in Mülheim, to the harshness of the prison system that had confined him for the greater part of his adult life. He presented himself not merely as a criminal, but as a product, the inevitable result of a chain of cruelties that had begun with his birth and had continued link by link through decades of abuse and deprivation and institutional violence, until the boy who'd been beaten in a one-room apartment had become the man who killed strangers in the parks of Düsseldorf. It was a narrative that possessed a certain dark coherence, and it was delivered with a persuasiveness that might, in other circumstances, have earned its speaker a measure of sympathy. But the circumstances were not other circumstances. The circumstances were a courtroom full of grieving families, and the speaker was a man who had stabbed a 5-year-old child 35 times with a pair of scissors, and the narrative, however coherent, could not bridge the gap between explanation and forgiveness. The trial also featured the testimony of the psychiatrist Carl Berg, who had been interviewing Kürten extensively since his arrest, and whose analysis of the defendant's mental state would later be published as the book that made Kürten a permanent fixture in the literature of criminal pathology. And Berg had conducted hours of interviews with Kürten, interviews in which the defendant had spoken with a candour and a specificity that Berg found unprecedented in his professional experience. Kürten had described his childhood, his fantasies, his compulsions, his methods, his motives, and his feelings, or rather his absence of feelings, with a completeness that allowed Berg to construct a detailed psychological portrait of the defendant. Berg's conclusion, presented to the court with the authority of his professional reputation, was unequivocal. Kürten was not insane. He was not suffering from any recognised form of mental illness that would have impaired his ability to understand the nature of his actions or to choose not to commit them. He was, in Berg's professional assessment, a man who had made a conscious and deliberate choice to pursue his compulsions to their ultimate expression, and who had done so with a degree of self-awareness and self-control that was, if anything, greater than that possessed by the average citizen. The trial lasted approximately 2 months. The evidence was presented, the witnesses were heard, the arguments were made, and on the day that the jury retired to consider its verdict, the courtroom fell into a silence that was not the silence of suspense, but the silence of inevitability. Everyone in the room, the judges, the lawyers, the journalists, the families, the defendant himself, knew what the verdict would be. The only question was how long the jury would take to reach it. The answer was 90 minutes. 90 minutes to consider 9 murders and 7 attempted murders, to weigh the evidence of 68 confessed crimes, to assess the testimony of survivors and psychiatrists and police officers, and to determine the guilt or innocence of the man who sat in the iron cage at the centre of the courtroom with the same expression of composed indifference that he had worn on the first day of the trial. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. 9 sentences of death, 1 for each of the lives that Peter Kürten had taken. The verdict was read aloud in the hushed courtroom, and when the last word had been spoken, Peter Kürten nodded once, as though he had been told something that he already knew, and then he turned and sat down in his cage and waited for the guards to take him away. The sentence was death by guillotine. Kürten received it without visible emotion. He had, in truth, been expecting it. Yeah, he had been expecting it since the moment he confessed to August, since the moment he stood in the street near the Rochuskirche and raised his hands to the police officers who surrounded him. The trial had been, for Kürten, not a contest, but a performance. A final opportunity to stand before an audience and describe the things he had done, to watch the faces of the people who listened, to absorb their horror and their revulsion, and their grief the way he had once absorbed the horror and the revulsion, and the grief of the citizens of Mülheim after the murder of Christine Klein. The courtroom was his last crime scene, and the families of his victims were his last victims, and the pain that his testimony inflicted upon them was the last pain he would ever cause. The condemned man was transferred to Klingelpütz Prison in Cologne to await his execution. The iron cage was dismantled, the courtroom was cleared, the journalists filed their dispatches, the families of the victims went home to their diminished households and their altered lives, and the city of Düsseldorf, which had lived in the shadow of the vampire for more than 2 years, began the long, uncertain process of learning to walk its own streets without fear. Chapter 10. The pleasure to end all pleasures. The cell in Klingelpütz Prison was small and spare, furnished with a cot, a chair, a table and a basin, the standard appointments of a condemned man's quarters in the Prussian penal tradition. The walls were of grey stone, the floor of bare concrete, the ceiling high enough to stand beneath but low enough to feel, in the hours before dawn when the silence was at its deepest, like a weight pressing down upon the chest of the man who lay beneath it. A single window, barred and set high in the wall, admitted a rectangle of light that moved across the floor as the day progressed, a slow, silent clock that measured the passage of hours with more honesty than any timepiece. Peter Kürten had spent a great deal of his life in rooms like this one, rooms that admitted no colour, no warmth, no sound save the distant footsteps of a guard in a corridor and the faint, rhythmic dripping of water from a pipe that no one had bothered to repair. But this room was different from all the others. This room had a date attached to it. This room had an ending. In the weeks and months between his sentencing and his execution, Kürten was visited regularly by the psychiatrist Karl Berg, who had been granted permission to continue the interviews he had begun after Kürten's arrest. These interviews, which would form the basis of Berg's landmark study, represented the first systematic psychological examination of a sexually motivated serial killer in the history of criminal science. Berg approached the task with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that his subject was not merely a criminal, but a specimen, a case study that, if documented with sufficient care and rigour, might illuminate the darkest and least understood regions of the human mind. He arrived at Klingelpütz with his notebooks and his questions and his pencils. And he sat across from Peter Kürten in the small visiting room and he listened. Kürten spoke freely. He spoke with a candour that Berg found both remarkable and deeply disturbing, a willingness to describe his innermost thoughts and compulsions and experiences with a precision and a completeness that suggested not confession but exhibition. He described his childhood in Mülheim, the violence of his father, the torture of animals, the drowning of his schoolmates. He described the murder of Christine Klein in 1913, the sound of the blood dripping from the child's wounds onto the floor, the pleasure he had derived from visiting her grave. He described the February attacks and the August murders and the November killing of Gertrude Albermann, each crime recounted in sequence. Each detail verified against the physical evidence and the testimony of the survivors. He described the sensation that the sight of blood produced in him, a sensation that he characterized as the central and defining experience of his life, the one thing that made him feel fully and completely alive. He described the fantasies that had sustained him through decades of imprisonment, the elaborate mental scenarios of violence and domination and bloodshed that he had constructed and refined and replayed in the darkness of his cells until they had acquired the vividness and the detail of actual memories. And he described, with a calmness that Berg found chilling, even by the standards of his professional experience, his complete and absolute lack of remorse for anything he had done. Berg listened. He took notes. He asked questions. He probed. And at the end of it all, after hours and days and weeks of interviews, he arrived at a conclusion that was as simple as it was terrifying. Peter Kürten was not a madman. He was not a lunatic driven by delusions or hallucinations or any of the other distortions of reality that characterize the clinically insane. He was a man who had developed, through a combination of childhood trauma and temperamental predisposition, and the peculiar crucible of the German penal system, an appetite for human suffering that was as real and as powerful and as resistant to suppression as the ordinary human appetites for food and drink and warmth. He had not killed because he could not help himself. He had killed because killing was the thing that gave his life its meaning, the thing that made the unbearable business of being Peter Kürten bearable. The fantasies, the arson, the torture of animals, the assaults, the murders, all of these had been expressions of a single, unified compulsion, a hunger for the sight and the sound and the smell of blood that nothing else could satisfy. Berg called it the most complete and the most extreme case of sadistic pathology that he had ever encountered. He called Kürten the king of the perverts, and he published his findings in a book that would become a classic of criminological literature, a book that would be read and studied and debated for decades, a book that would cast a long shadow over the fledgling discipline of criminal psychology, and that would ensure that the name Peter Kürten would be remembered long after the last witness to his crimes had died. The date of the execution was set for the 2nd of July, 1931. In the days preceding it, Kürten received visits from a priest who attempted, with the patient determination of a man accustomed to ministering to the condemned, to lead the prisoner towards some form of spiritual reckoning. Whether Kürten engaged with the priest's efforts in any genuine way is not recorded. What is recorded is that Kürten remained calm throughout the final days of his life, displaying none of the agitation, the despair, the last-minute remorse that the prison staff had come to expect from men who stood in the shadow of the guillotine. He ate his meals, he slept his hours, he spoke, when spoken to, with the same quiet politeness that had characterized his interactions with the world for as long as anyone could remember. The guards who watched over him in those final days would later remark upon the strangeness of it, the way that Kürten seemed not merely resigned to his fate but almost indifferent to it, as though the prospect of his own death held for him neither terror nor sorrow, but merely a mild, detached curiosity. On the evening of the 1st of July, Peter Kürten ate his last meal. He requested Wiener Schnitzel, fried potatoes, and a bottle of white wine. The request was granted. The meal was brought to his cell on a tray, and Kürten ate it in its entirety, with the unhurried appreciation of a man dining at a restaurant rather than a man eating his final meal on earth. When he had finished, he looked at the empty plate and the empty bottle, and he asked the guard whether he might have a second helping. The request was unexpected. The guard consulted his superiors. The superiors, perhaps moved by the proximity of the occasion to some residual impulse of generosity, agreed. A second serving of Wiener Schnitzel and fried potatoes was prepared and delivered to the cell. Kürten ate the second meal with the same deliberate relish with which he had eaten the first. Then he set down his fork and his knife, and he folded his napkin, and he lay down on his cot, and he slept. The morning of the 2nd of July, 1931, arrived in Cologne with the grey, muted light that is characteristic of summer dawns in the Rhineland, a light that seems to rise not from the horizon but from the earth itself, seeping upward through the mist that clings to the river and the rooftops and the spires of the cathedral until the city is wrapped in a luminescence that is neither bright nor dark but something in between. Yet something provisional, something that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to become. The guillotine had been erected in the courtyard of Klingelpütz Prison, a device of wood and metal and sharpened steel that had been constructed for a single purpose, and that would, on this morning, fulfill that purpose with the mechanical precision for which it had been designed. The executioner was a man named Karl Groppler, a professional in the service of the state, a man whose occupation required of him a steadiness of hand and a detachment of spirit that most human beings would find impossible to sustain. He stood beside the device in the early morning light and waited. At 6 o'clock, Peter Kürten was led from his cell. He walked unassisted, thus he flanked on one side by the prison psychiatrist and on the other by the priest who had attended him in his final days. His hands were not bound, his steps were steady. His face bore an expression that the witnesses who were present would later describe in various ways as calm, as blank, as faintly curious, as though he were walking towards something that interested him rather than something that would end him. He crossed the courtyard with the measured pace of a man who was in no hurry, and who had no reason to be in a hurry, because the destination was fixed, and the outcome was certain, and no amount of haste or delay could alter either. He reached the guillotine. He looked at it. He looked at the executioner. He looked at the prison psychiatrist who stood beside him. A man who had spent months studying the mind of Peter Kürten, and who now stood, in the grey light of a July morning, at the edge of the abyss that separated the study of a mind from the destruction of it. And then Peter Kürten spoke. He turned to the psychiatrist, and in a voice that was quiet and steady and utterly without tremor, he asked a question. He asked whether, after his head had been severed from his body, he would still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of his own blood gushing from the stump of his neck. He paused. He let the question hang in the air between them, a question that was not really a question at all, but a final declaration, a last testament to the thing that had governed his life and defined his crimes and brought him to this courtyard on this morning. And then he added, with a softness that might, in another context, have been mistaken for tenderness, that such a thing would be the pleasure to end all pleasures. The psychiatrist did not answer. There was no answer to give. The question was not addressed to him, not really. It was addressed to the morning and the mist and the grey stone walls of the prison and the silent machine that waited to do its work. It was addressed to the blood itself, the blood that had been the object of Peter Kürten's lifelong obsession, the substance that had drawn him from the dog-catcher's room in Mülheim through decades of prison cells and city streets and darkened parks to this final, inevitable point. He had lived for blood. He had killed for blood. And now, at the end, he wished to hear his own. The executioner asked Kürten whether he had any last words. Kürten smiled. It was a small smile. A private smile, the smile of a man who has been asked a question to which the answer is so obvious that the asking of it is almost comical. He said no, there was nothing more to say. There had never been anything to say. The words had always been inadequate. The thing that Peter Kürten was could not be captured in language, could not be explained by psychiatry, could not be punished by law, could not be understood by the ordinary human beings who had sat in the courtroom and listened to his testimony and tried, with all the tools at their disposal, to comprehend how a man who looked like everyone else could have done the things that he had done. The thing that Peter Kürten was existed beyond comprehension, beyond language, beyond the reach of the institutions that had tried to contain it, and the professionals who had tried to understand it. It existed in the sealed chamber of a mind that was about to be destroyed, and with its destruction, the last and only witness to its true nature would be silence forever. Peter Kürten knelt. He placed his head upon the block. The blade was raised. The courtyard was silent. The mist hung in the air above the prison walls, and the cathedral spires of Cologne rose in the distance like the fingers of a hand reaching toward a heaven that offered no answers, and the river moved on in its ancient, indifferent way, carrying the debris of the night toward the sea. The blade fell. In the years that followed, the legacy of Peter Kürten would extend far beyond the courtyard of Klingelpütz Prison. Carl Berg published his study, and the study became a cornerstone of the emerging science of criminal psychology, the first comprehensive analysis of a sexually motivated serial killer, a work that would influence every subsequent attempt to understand and to classify and to predict the behaviour of those who kill not for profit or for passion but for pleasure. The filmmaker Fritz Lang, who had followed the case from Berlin, created a motion picture that drew its inspiration from the terror that Kürten had visited upon Düsseldorf, a film that would be recognised in the decades that followed as one of the masterworks of the cinema, a dark and haunting meditation on the nature of evil and the inadequacy of the systems that civilization has constructed to protect itself from those who would destroy it. The mummified head of Peter Kürten was preserved and eventually transported to the United States, where it was placed on display in a museum of curiosities, a final, grotesque indignity visited upon the remains of a man who had, in life, visited indignities beyond counting upon the bodies of his victims, and in Düsseldorf, the city that had lived in the shadow of the vampire, life resumed. The streets were walked again after dark. The parks were visited again on summer evenings. The children were allowed, gradually and with a caution that took years to fully dissipate, to play unsupervised in the courtyards and the gardens that had once been places of terror. The memory of 1929 faded slowly, unevenly, the way all memories of horror fade, not into oblivion but into a kind of scar tissue. A thickened place in the collective consciousness of a city that had survived something that should not have been survivable. The names of the victims were not forgotten. They were spoken quietly in the homes of the families that had lost them, spoken on anniversaries, spoken in prayers, spoken in the private language of grief that needs no audience and no validation and no end. Rosa Oliger, Rudolf Scheer, Maria Hahn, Gertrude Hamacher, Louisa Lenzen, Ida Reuter, Elisabeth Dorier, Gertrude Albermann, Christine Klein. 9 names, 9 lives, 9 candles extinguished by a hand that moved in darkness and was, at last, itself extinguished. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent. The mist over Cologne dissolved in the warmth of the rising sun, and the river carried the last of the night toward the sea, and history, as it always does, turned the page in the dark,